Before you settle in for the night, let me ask you a simple question. How does a small collection of wooden huts beside an ordinary river become one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known? Tonight, we're going to find out. Over the next few hours, we'll travel through more than 1,000 years of Roman history, from the quiet hills overlooking the Tiber River to the height of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Along the way, we'll meet ambitious kings, determined farmers, brilliant generals, stubborn senators, fearless explorers, ordinary families, and a few unforgettable characters who probably made life far more complicated than it needed to be. We'll discover how Rome grew from a settlement that almost no one outside Italy had heard of into a civilization whose influence can still be felt in our laws, our languages, our architecture, and even the roads beneath our feet. But we'll also spend time with the people. History books often rush past. The bakers who woke before sunrise, the merchants bargaining in crowded markets, the soldiers wondering if they'd ever see home again, and the children who had no idea they were growing up in the city that would one day shape the course of history. This isn't the story of a single battle or a single emperor. It's the story of generations of ordinary people whose choices, victories, failures, and everyday lives slowly built something extraordinary, one year at a time. So, if you're already comfortable, take a slow breath, let the rest of the day drift into the background, and allow yourself to travel back more than 2,000 years. Our journey begins long before marble temples, long before gladiators entered the Colosseum, and long before anyone could have imagined an empire. It begins beside a quiet river, where history is about to change forever. Night settles quietly over central Italy. The last glow of the sun slips behind a line of distant hills, leaving the countryside wrapped in cool evening air. Crickets begin their nightly chorus from the tall grass, while somewhere beyond the trees, the gentle current of the Tiber River continues its slow journey toward the sea. A wolf calls in the distance. The sound lingers for a moment before fading into silence, replaced once again by the steady crackle of small cooking fires. For the families gathered around those fires, tonight feels completely ordinary. Children chase one another between simple wooden huts until tired parents finally convince them that tomorrow will arrive much earlier than they would like. A shepherd checks his flock one last time before darkness settles over the hills. Someone quietly repairs a broken wooden handle that absolutely refuses to survive another harvest. Nearby, 2 neighbors debate whether this year's weather has been unusually strange or whether they're simply getting older. Every generation seems convinced that the weather was better when they were young. History, it turns out, often begins in places that feel wonderfully uneventful. If you had wandered through this settlement more than 27 centuries ago, nothing would have suggested that you were standing near the birthplace of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. There were no towering temples, no magnificent palaces, no triumphal arches stretching across broad stone roads. There wasn't even a city in the way we would recognize one today. Only scattered communities of farmers, shepherds, traders, and craftsmen living ordinary lives beside an ordinary river. And yet, hidden inside those ordinary days was an extraordinary future. Looking backward through history creates an interesting illusion. Once we know how the story ends, every step along the way begins to feel inevitable. Of course, Rome became powerful. Of course, it built an empire. Of course, its influence spread across continents. But none of that felt obvious to the people living here. In fact, if someone had confidently predicted that this quiet settlement would one day dominate much of the known world, they probably would have received a polite smile, followed by a suggestion to spend less time sitting in the sun. After all, Rome wasn't the center of anything. Not yet. Across the Mediterranean, civilizations with far longer histories already flourished. Egypt had spent thousands of years building monuments that still inspire awe today. Powerful kingdoms had risen and fallen throughout the Near East. Greek cities buzzed with philosophy, trade, politics, and art. Compared to those places, central Italy was hardly the destination ambitious travelers dreamed about visiting. But history has a habit of overlooking the obvious favorites. Sometimes the place that changes the world is the place no one expected. The Italian peninsula occupies a remarkably fortunate position. Stretching deep into the Mediterranean Sea, it sits between Eastern and Western cultures like a bridge connecting different worlds. To the north, the towering Alps form a rugged natural barrier. Running down the spine of the peninsula, the Apennine Mountains divide the landscape into valleys, forests, and fertile plains, creating countless places where small communities could establish themselves while remaining connected through trade and travel. That geography mattered more than anyone realized. Communities separated by mountains often developed their own customs, traditions, and even dialects. Yet rivers and coastal routes still allowed ideas to spread from one region to another. A tool invented hundreds of miles away could eventually reach these hills. New farming techniques slowly traveled from village to village. Religious beliefs mixed together over generations. Even recipes wandered surprisingly far. Human beings have always enjoyed borrowing a neighbor's good ideas, especially if those ideas happened to taste better than dinner. Flowing through this landscape was the Tiber River. By modern standards, it isn't especially impressive. It doesn't rival the Nile or the Danube, and if you stood beside it today without knowing its history, you might wonder why anyone talks about it at all. It seems almost modest. But rivers rarely become important because they're the biggest. They become important because people need them. Fresh water meant survival. Fertile soil meant reliable harvests. Boats could transport goods far more easily than wagons struggling through dense forests. Travelers naturally gathered where rivers could be crossed, and wherever travelers gathered, opportunities soon followed. Markets appeared. Craftsmen settled nearby. Farmers found new customers. Merchants discovered profitable routes. Little by little, almost without anyone noticing, isolated families slowly became thriving communities. Cities are rarely born all at once. They accumulate. One family builds a home. Another joins them the following spring. A blacksmith realizes there is enough work to stay permanently. Someone opens a small market. A carpenter repairs roofs. A potter begins selling jars to travelers passing through. Years pass. Children grow into adults. Those adults build homes of their own. Generation after generation, a settlement quietly expands until one day people stop thinking of it as a collection of houses and begin thinking of it as their town. That's one of history's favorite tricks. The biggest changes often happen so gradually that the people living through them hardly notice. Life in these early communities demanded constant effort. Long before sunrise, smoke curled upward from cooking fires as families prepared simple meals of grain, bread, herbs, and whatever the season had provided. Shepherds guided sheep into nearby fields, while farmers inspected crops with the practiced eyes of people who understood that a single week of bad weather could undo months of hard work. Water had to be carried, fences repaired, animals protected, firewood gathered before winter. There were always more jobs than daylight. It wasn't easy, but it also wasn't miserable. That's another misunderstanding we sometimes have about the ancient world. It's easy to imagine everyone spending every waking moment struggling to survive. Certainly life was harder than it is today, but people still celebrated weddings, laughed with friends, complained about difficult neighbors, spoiled their children when they thought no one was looking, and gathered together during festivals to eat, sing, and tell stories long into the evening. Some parts of being human never really go out of style. Those stories mattered. Long before books became common, history traveled by voice. Parents passed stories to children. Grandparents added details that may or may not have improved with each retelling. And entire communities built their identities around tales explaining who they were and where they had come from. Some stories were true. Others grew larger every time they were told. Most landed somewhere in between. Before long, one particular story would rise above all the others. It would tell of two brothers, a river, a king consumed by fear, and a she-wolf whose name would become inseparable from the birth of Rome. Whether every detail truly happened is another question entirely, but the fact that Romans believed the story tells us something just as important as history itself. For the Romans, the story of their city didn't begin with an architect laying out streets or a ruler declaring that a new settlement should be built. It began with a legend. And like many legends that survive for centuries, it blended history, memory, symbolism, and imagination so seamlessly that even the Romans themselves understood it carried truths beyond simple facts. Whether every event happened exactly as the story tells us is impossible to know. Archaeologists continue to uncover evidence about early Rome, while historians compare ancient accounts written hundreds of years after the events they describe. The details remain open to debate. The importance of the legend, however, does not. It shaped the identity of Rome for centuries, influencing how Romans saw themselves and how they wanted the rest of the world to see them. The story begins not in Rome, but in the nearby city of Alba Longa. According to Roman tradition, Alba Longa was founded generations earlier by the descendants of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who escaped the destruction of Troy and eventually found his way to Italy. Whether Aeneas himself truly made that journey is another mystery, but the connection mattered enormously to the Romans. It gave their civilization an origin tied to one of the ancient world's greatest epic stories, linking Rome not only to Italy, but to the legendary Age of Heroes. If you're going to create a founding myth, beginning with a survivor of the Trojan War is certainly an ambitious way to start. Generations passed, and the throne of Alba Longa eventually came under the control of a man named Amulius. He had seized power from his brother, Numitor, and like many rulers who gain authority through questionable methods, he spent much of his time worrying that someone else might do the same to him. History offers plenty of examples of ambitious leaders discovering that paranoia often arrives shortly after the crown. To secure his position, Amulius removed anyone who might someday challenge his rule. Numitor's sons were killed, and his daughter, Rhea Silvia, was forced to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn never to marry or have children. From Amulius' perspective, it was a practical solution. No children meant no future rivals. The plan was ruthless, but simple. History, however, has a remarkable habit of ignoring simple plans. According to the legend, Rhea Silvia was visited by Mars, the Roman god of war, and gave birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Whether the Romans believed Mars was literally their father or understood the story more symbolically likely varied from person to person. Either way, the message was clear. These were no ordinary children. From the moment they entered the story, destiny seemed to be walking beside them. Amulius reacted exactly as frightened rulers often do when confronted with a prophecy they don't like. He ordered the infants to be killed. Even that command, however, refused to cooperate with history. The servant assigned to carry out the order reportedly could not bring himself to murder 2 newborn children. Instead, the twins were placed inside a basket and set adrift on the swollen waters of the Tiber River, leaving fate to decide what happened next. It was a desperate compromise, one that shifted responsibility from human hands to the unpredictable current of the river. Ironically, the flooding that made the river so dangerous also saved their lives. Rather than carrying the basket out to sea, the water became trapped among the roots of a fig tree near the base of the Palatine Hill. There, according to one of history's most enduring legends, the cries of the infants attracted an unlikely guardian, a she-wolf. Few images are more closely connected to Rome than the she-wolf standing over 2 small children. Even today, statues of the scene can be found throughout Italy and far beyond. To the Romans, she represented more than an animal. She symbolized resilience, protection, and survival against impossible odds. Modern historians have debated whether the story may contain symbolic meanings or echoes of older traditions, but regardless of its origins, the image became inseparable from Rome itself. The legend continues by telling us that the twins were later discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus. He and his wife, Acca Larentia, raised the boys as their own, unaware, or perhaps only partly aware, of the extraordinary future waiting for them. Their childhood was spent not in royal palaces, but among fields, forests, and hills, learning the practical skills needed to survive. They hunted, tended livestock, settled disputes with other shepherds, and developed reputations as natural leaders long before anyone spoke of kingdoms. There's something fitting about that part of the story. Rome would eventually become famous for discipline, hard work, and resilience, and its legendary founders were said to have learned those values not from luxury, but from ordinary life. Whether historically accurate or not, the lesson was exactly the sort of story Romans admired. As the twins grew older, the truth about their birth eventually came to light. Realizing that their grandfather Numitor had been robbed of his throne, Romulus and Remus gathered supporters, confronted Amulius, and overthrew him. Numitor was restored as king, bringing the legend full circle. It would be a satisfying ending in almost any other story. For Rome, it was only the beginning. The brothers decided to establish a new settlement near the place where they had been rescued as infants. It seemed appropriate. After all, if the gods, or fortune, depending on your point of view, had spared their lives there, perhaps that land carried a special significance. But then came a question that sounds almost trivial at first. Which brother would rule? History has often turned on questions that seem surprisingly small in the moment. The brothers reportedly disagreed over which hill should become the center of the new city and sought signs from the gods through the flight of birds. Romulus claimed one omen favored him. Remus argued that another favored him instead. What began as a disagreement over divine approval soon became something far more personal. Pride entered the conversation, then anger, then tragedy. In the version of the legend most often told, Remus mocked the walls Romulus had begun building by leaping over them as a joke, suggesting they offered little real protection. It was exactly the sort of teasing that siblings have probably been inflicting on one another since the beginning of time. Romulus did not find it amusing. The argument escalated, and Remus was killed. It's a surprisingly dark ending for the birth of one of history's greatest cities, yet perhaps that's part of why the story endured. Rome did not imagine itself as a civilization born into perfect harmony. Even its own founding myth acknowledged ambition, sacrifice, rivalry, and loss. Greatness, the Romans believed, often demanded an uncomfortable price. According to tradition, Romulus founded the city on April 21st, 753 BC, naming it Rome after himself. Whether that exact date is historically correct remains uncertain, but archaeologists have found evidence that settlements on the hills of Rome were indeed growing together during roughly this period. The legend and the archaeology do not match perfectly, but they overlap just enough to make the story even more fascinating. As generations passed, Romans would celebrate Romulus as the city's first king, honoring him as the founder who transformed scattered settlements into the beginnings of a united community. Yet legends, powerful as they are, can only carry a story so far. Soon, myth begins giving way to history. The huts become neighborhoods. The footpaths become streets, the settlement becomes a city, and the people living beside the Tiber discover that building Rome may prove even more extraordinary than imagining it. When people think about ancient Rome, they often picture marble temples, disciplined legions marching beneath crimson banners, or emperors giving speeches before enormous crowds. It's easy to forget that none of those things existed yet. The Rome founded by Romulus was not an empire. It wasn't even a large city. It was, by every modern standard, remarkably small. Yet what it lacked in size, it made up for in ambition, adaptability, and an uncanny ability to survive. If you had climbed one of the nearby hills shortly after Rome's legendary founding, the view would have looked surprisingly modest. Smoke drifted lazily from thatched rooftops clustered along the Palatine Hill. Chickens wandered wherever they pleased, apparently convinced they owned the place. Goats grazed along rocky slopes, while children chased each other over dusty paths that would someday become streets known across the ancient world. The city wasn't planned with perfect symmetry or impressive architecture. It grew the same way most early settlements did, one family, one house, and one generation at a time. The earliest homes were simple structures built from timber, mud brick, and bundles of straw. Floors were packed earth, furniture was scarce, and windows were either very small or non-existent. During winter, smoke from indoor fires often lingered beneath the roof before slowly escaping through small openings above. It wasn't exactly luxurious living. On the other hand, it probably did a wonderful job of convincing everyone to spend more time outdoors. Outside those homes, however, life buzzed with quiet purpose. Farmers left before sunrise to tend fields of wheat and barley. Shepherds guided sheep and goats across nearby hills in search of fresh grazing land. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into tools that would help build houses, clear forests, and cultivate farmland. potters shaped clay into jars for storing grain, wine, and olive oil. Every member of the community contributed something. In a settlement this small, there were very few opportunities to simply blend into the crowd. Rome's location continued to shape its future in ways that its inhabitants could hardly appreciate. Merchants traveling through central Italy found the settlement conveniently positioned near an important crossing of the Tiber River. Some arrived carrying metals from the north. Others brought salt from the coast, livestock from inland communities, or finely crafted pottery from neighboring cultures. Goods changed hands. So did stories. Travelers exchanged news about distant villages, political disputes, successful harvests, and occasionally exaggerated tales that somehow became even more impressive every time they were retold. Human beings, it seems, perfected the art of embellishment long before the invention of the internet. As trade increased, so did opportunity. A farmer who produced more grain than his family needed could trade the surplus for tools. A craftsman might exchange pottery for livestock. A shepherd could barter wool for stronger farming equipment. These small exchanges gradually created a local economy, weaving together people who depended on one another in countless ways. No one became wealthy overnight, but little by little the settlement grew stronger because each person specialized in what they did best. Of course, survival required more than farming and trade. The hills surrounding Rome provided natural defenses, but they could not guarantee safety. Neighboring communities sometimes competed for land, livestock, or valuable resources. Raids were an unfortunate reality of life throughout much of ancient Italy. As a result, every able-bodied man was expected to help defend the settlement when danger appeared. There were no full-time professional soldiers waiting in barracks. If trouble arrived, the same farmer who had been planting crops that morning might spend the afternoon carrying a spear alongside his neighbors. That expectation shaped Roman society from the very beginning. Military service wasn't viewed as a separate profession reserved for a select few. It was simply another responsibility of citizenship. A man worked his fields, raised his family, participated in religious festivals, and, when necessary, defended his home. Those roles weren't divided into separate parts of life. They were all part of being Roman. According to Roman tradition, King Romulus recognized that the growing settlement needed more than sturdy walls and determined citizens. It also needed structure. A community without rules could survive for a while, but a city hoping to endure required laws, customs, and leadership. Romulus is said to have organized the population into groups, established early military units, and created a council of respected elders who would advise the king. Those elders eventually became known as the Senate, a name that would echo throughout Roman history for centuries to come. The word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. That wasn't intended as an insult. In the ancient world, age often represented experience, wisdom, and judgment. Of course, anyone who has ever attended a long meeting knows that experience doesn't necessarily make discussions shorter. Even Rome's earliest political debates probably involved at least one person saying, "We've always done it this way." Whether every detail of Romulus's reforms happened exactly as later writers described remains uncertain. Ancient historians often blended legend with fact, especially when writing about Rome's earliest years. What does seem clear, however, is that early Rome developed institutions remarkably quickly. Leadership, military organization, religious traditions, and social customs all evolved together, creating a framework that would allow the settlement to expand far beyond its humble beginnings. Religion stood at the center of nearly every important decision. Before planting crops, beginning construction, or marching into battle, Romans believed it was wise to seek the favor of the gods. Priests carefully observed sacred rituals, interpreted signs from nature, and offered sacrifices meant to maintain harmony between the human world and the divine. Success wasn't viewed as the product of hard work alone. Prosperity depended on respecting both tradition and the gods who, it was believed, watched over every aspect of life. Even the city's boundaries carried religious meaning. According to tradition, when Romulus first marked the limits of Rome, he plowed a sacred furrow around the settlement, symbolically separating the ordered world within from the uncertainty beyond. Crossing that boundary wasn't merely a physical act, it carried spiritual significance as well. To the Romans, cities were more than collections of buildings. They were communities protected by shared beliefs, shared responsibilities, and shared destiny. Still, despite these early successes, Rome remained just one settlement among many scattered across central Italy. Powerful neighbors surrounded it. Some possessed larger populations. Others had greater wealth, stronger fortifications, or more advanced technology. Nothing guaranteed that Rome would survive the coming centuries, let alone dominate them. In fact, one neighboring civilization would soon leave a lasting mark on Rome, teaching its people new skills, influencing its religion, transforming its architecture, and helping shape the city into something far greater than its founders could ever have imagined. Those neighbors were known as the Etruscans, and without them, Rome might have become a very different city indeed. Long before Rome became the dominant power in Italy, another civilization flourished just to the north. They built impressive cities, engineered massive stone walls, traded across the Mediterranean, and produced works of art that still fascinate archaeologists today. They were known as the Etruscans, and for centuries they were among the most sophisticated people on the Italian peninsula. To the early Romans, the Etruscans were not mysterious figures from history books. They were neighbors. Sometimes they were trading partners. Sometimes they were rivals. Occasionally they were both at the same time, which, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is a surprisingly common arrangement. Unlike the small settlements that dotted much of central Italy, Etruscan cities were carefully planned and remarkably advanced. Streets followed organized layouts. Buildings were constructed from durable stone instead of simple timber, and public spaces reflected a level of engineering that would have seemed extraordinary to many surrounding communities. Their craftsmen worked with bronze, iron, and gold in ways that earned admiration throughout the Mediterranean. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover beautifully crafted jewelry, sculptures, and painted tombs that reveal a civilization rich in both skill and imagination. The Romans watched carefully. One of the greatest strengths Rome would eventually develop was its willingness to learn from others. Rather than rejecting foreign ideas simply because they came from somewhere else, the Romans often asked a far more practical question: does it work? If the answer was yes, they usually found a way to adapt it for themselves. That habit would become one of Rome's greatest advantages. The Romans borrowed architectural techniques, religious customs, engineering knowledge, military practices, and even parts of their alphabet from neighboring cultures. Some of these influences came from the Greeks, others from the Etruscans, and many evolved into something uniquely Roman over time. Rome's genius was rarely inventing everything from scratch. Its genius was taking good ideas, improving them, and using them on a scale few civilizations could match. It may not sound glamorous, but copying the best ideas available is often a surprisingly effective strategy. History tends to remember the winners far more than it remembers who originally had the idea. As Rome continued to grow, its population expanded beyond a handful of related families. Farmers arrived seeking fertile land. Traders recognized new opportunities. Craftsmen established workshops. Travelers chose to settle rather than continue their journeys. With each passing generation, the settlement became more diverse, bringing together people with different backgrounds, traditions, and beliefs. That diversity created opportunities, but it also created challenges. How do you unite people who don't all share the same customs? How do you convince strangers to think of themselves as one community? Those questions would shape Roman society for centuries. According to Roman tradition, one answer was surprisingly simple: offer people a chance to become Romans. Unlike many ancient societies that tightly guarded membership within their communities, Rome often proved remarkably willing to absorb newcomers. While full citizenship developed gradually over time and came with different rights depending on the period, the basic idea remained consistent. Loyalty to Rome mattered more than where someone had originally come from. It was an idea that would eventually allow Rome to expand in ways few other civilizations ever managed. Of course, growth also meant that disagreements became inevitable. Land had to be divided, resources had to be shared, laws had to be enforced. As more people settled around the hills overlooking the Tiber, leaders found themselves making increasingly complicated decisions. A dispute over farmland might affect dozens of families. A disagreement between merchants could interrupt trade. Even something as simple as repairing roads or maintaining public wells required cooperation. Building a city, it turns out, involves a surprising number of meetings. Fortunately for the Romans, they seemed unusually comfortable arguing with one another. In fact, if there's one tradition that remained remarkably consistent throughout Roman history, it was vigorous debate. Kings argued with advisors, senators argued with other senators, generals argued with politicians, politicians argued with everyone. If someone had proposed inventing a committee solely to discuss whether another committee should be created, Rome probably would have considered it. Yet, beneath all the disagreements lay a growing sense of shared identity. People began thinking of themselves not merely as members of individual families or villages, but as part of something larger. Festivals brought communities together to honor the gods. Markets encouraged cooperation between strangers. Military service reminded citizens that defending Rome required everyone, regardless of wealth or background. Slowly, almost invisibly, loyalty shifted. The city itself became part of a person's identity. That idea may seem ordinary today, but in the ancient world, it carried enormous significance. Rome was no longer simply a place where people happened to live. It was becoming something people believed in. As the decades passed, new kings succeeded Romulus, each leaving behind stories of reforms, construction projects, religious ceremonies, and political changes. Ancient historians credited these rulers with strengthening Rome's institutions, expanding its territory, and transforming what had once been a modest settlement into one of the most important communities in central Italy. Some of those stories are almost certainly embellished. Others may contain only fragments of historical truth. Separating fact from legend is one of the greatest challenges historians face when studying Rome's earliest centuries. The Romans themselves recorded much of this history hundreds of years after the events supposedly occurred, meaning memory, tradition, and patriotic storytelling often became intertwined. It's a little like asking someone today to describe exactly what happened at a family gathering 5 generations ago. By the time the story reaches you, someone has almost certainly improved the ending. Even so, archaeology confirms that Rome truly was growing. The population increased. Trade expanded. Homes spread across neighboring hills. Public spaces became more organized. What had once been scattered villages slowly merged into a single, thriving community. The transformation wasn't dramatic enough for anyone living through it to notice from one day to the next. But if a traveler returned after 50 years, they might barely recognize the place. The Rome they remembered had become something larger, stronger, and far more ambitious. It was still vulnerable, still surrounded by powerful rivals, still uncertain about its future. But one thing had quietly changed forever. Rome no longer thought like a village. It had begun thinking like a city, and before long, that city would face its first great test, one that would overthrow its kings, reshape its government, and lay the foundation for the republic that would eventually conquer much of the known world. For nearly 2.5 centuries, according to Roman tradition, the city was ruled by kings. Today, the word king often brings to mind glittering crowns, sprawling palaces, and enormous royal courts. Early Rome looked nothing like that. Its kings probably lived more comfortably than the average farmer, but they certainly weren't wandering marble hallways surrounded by dozens of servants. Rome was still a growing city, and its rulers spent as much time solving practical problems as they did making grand decisions. Someone had to organize defenses, settle disputes over land, oversee religious ceremonies, and somehow convince neighboring communities that Rome was worth taking seriously. Being king, it turns out, involved a surprising amount of administration. The Romans later believed there had been 7 kings, beginning with Romulus and ending with Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, better known simply as Tarquin the Proud. Whether there were exactly 7 rulers is difficult to prove. Ancient historians loved neat numbers, and 7 appears with suspicious frequency throughout history. 7 hills, 7 kings. It's almost as if ancient storytellers appreciated a satisfying list as much as modern internet articles do. Still, behind those legendary figures lies evidence that Rome really was changing. Each ruler was credited with strengthening a different part of the young city. Romulus supposedly established its military foundations. Numa Pompilius was remembered as a deeply religious king who organized many of Rome's sacred traditions. Tullus Hostilius emphasized warfare, while Ancus Marcius expanded trade and improved the city's connection to the Tiber River. Later kings, many believed to have Etruscan roots, oversaw ambitious building projects that permanently transformed Rome's appearance. Whether every accomplishment belonged exactly to the king later credited with it is uncertain. What matters is that these developments truly happened. Somebody built them, somebody organized them, somebody turned a collection of villages into a functioning city. One of the greatest challenges facing early Rome was something most visitors never thought about until it became a problem. Water. Not drinking water. Too much water. The valleys between Rome's famous hills frequently flooded after heavy rains. Mud collected in low areas, creating stagnant pools where insects thrived and travel became difficult. Imagine trying to walk through your local town if several streets transformed into swamps every time it rained. It's safe to say property values would suffer. The Romans responded the way they often would throughout their history. They built something. Among the most remarkable engineering projects of early Rome was the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest large-scale drainage systems. Rather than accepting flooded valleys as an unavoidable inconvenience, Roman engineers designed enormous stone channels that carried excess water into the Tiber River. Portions of this ancient drainage system still exist today, more than 2,000 years later. That's a recurring theme you'll notice throughout Roman history. When faced with a problem, the Romans often didn't ask whether it could be solved. They asked how much stone would be required. Engineering gradually became one of Rome's defining strengths. Roads, bridges, walls, temples, aqueducts, and harbors would eventually stretch across 3 continents. But those achievements began with relatively modest projects like draining marshy ground and constructing reliable public infrastructure. Great civilizations rarely begin with grand monuments. More often, they begin by solving annoyingly practical problems. As the city expanded, so did its population. The 7 hills that once supported scattered settlements slowly became connected into a single urban community. Markets grew busier, workshops multiplied, traders arrived from increasingly distant regions. The sound of hammers striking bronze echoed through narrow streets while merchants called out prices for grain, livestock, pottery, wine, and olive oil. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the morning air, occasionally competing with less pleasant odors produced by livestock wandering wherever they pleased. Ancient cities had many remarkable qualities. Pleasant smells were not always among them. Even so, daily life reflected a growing sense of stability. Families gathered each morning around simple meals before beginning another day's work. Farmers traveled beyond the city walls to cultivate nearby fields. Craftsmen opened workshops where apprentices slowly learned their trades. Children played games using stones, sticks, or whatever else happened to be lying nearby. Education existed, although much of it occurred at home, where parents taught practical skills alongside family traditions. In the evenings, many roads led toward the city's marketplaces. Markets served purposes far beyond buying and selling. They were places where neighbors exchanged news, travelers shared stories from distant regions, politicians quietly built support, and rumors spread with astonishing efficiency. Human beings have always enjoyed discussing other people's business, and ancient Rome appears to have been no exception. Long before newspapers, information traveled from person to person, changing slightly with every conversation until the original story sometimes became almost unrecognizable. Religion remained woven into nearly every aspect of daily life. Temples gradually appeared throughout the city, dedicated to various gods believed to watch over different parts of existence. Farmers prayed for successful harvests. Soldiers sought protection before battle. Merchants asked for prosperous journeys. Families honored household spirits believed to safeguard their homes. Festivals interrupted the routine of daily work, filling streets with music, processions, sacrifices, and shared meals that strengthened the bonds holding the growing community together. To outsiders, these ceremonies may have appeared mysterious. To the Romans, they were simply part of living. Respecting the gods wasn't viewed as optional, it was considered practical. After all, if divine beings truly influenced weather, harvests, health, and military success, ignoring them seemed like an unnecessary risk. By now, Rome was no longer an insignificant settlement beside the Tiber. Its influence was steadily expanding across central Italy. Its population continued growing. Its confidence grew with it. But prosperity often creates new problems. As wealth increased, so did inequality. As power expanded, ambitious leaders discovered greater opportunities to abuse it. And before long, one Roman king would push his authority so far that the people of Rome would decide they had endured enough. The final king of Rome was a man the Romans remembered with a name that tells you almost everything you need to know about his reputation: Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Whether he truly earned that title during his lifetime, or whether later generations attached it to him afterward, is impossible to say. History is often written by those who come after, and people who overthrow governments rarely describe the previous ruler as pleasant enough once you got to know him. Even so, Roman tradition consistently paints Tarquin as a king whose ambition eventually outweighed his wisdom. Unlike earlier rulers who were remembered for strengthening Rome through construction, religion, or law, Tarquin became famous for ruling through fear. He relied heavily on personal authority rather than cooperation. Important decisions increasingly rested in his own hands, while many members of Rome's leading families found themselves ignored or pushed aside. The Senate, which earlier kings had treated as an important advisory council, reportedly met less often and carried far less influence. Whether every detail is historically accurate remains uncertain, but the overall message is remarkably consistent across Roman tradition. Power, once concentrated, has a tendency to demand even more power. To be fair, Tarquin was not an entirely ineffective ruler. Far from it. Under his reign, Rome continued to expand. Construction projects transformed the city, including the magnificent Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, one of the most important religious buildings Rome would ever possess. Roads improved, defensive works continued, trade remained active. Visitors arriving in Rome would have seen a city growing wealthier and more impressive with each passing year. The difficulty was not whether Rome prospered. It was how that prosperity was achieved. According to Roman historians, Tarquin increasingly relied on forced labor to complete his projects. Citizens were expected to work on public construction, whether they wished to or not. Political opponents found little room to disagree. Fear gradually replaced trust as the foundation of government. History offers countless examples of rulers who believed strength alone could guarantee stability. It rarely works for very long. The breaking point, according to Roman tradition, came through an event that had almost nothing to do with politics. Instead, it began with a conversation. Several young Roman noblemen were returning from military service when they began debating whose wife was the most virtuous. Rather than continue arguing, they decided to settle the matter in the most dramatic way possible. They would ride home unannounced. One by one, they visited their households. Many of the women they encountered were enjoying lavish banquets or entertaining guests. There was nothing particularly wrong with that, but one house looked very different. There, they found Lucretia. She wasn't hosting a feast. She wasn't surrounded by luxury. Instead, she sat quietly with servants, spinning wool late into the evening while managing her household with diligence and discipline. To the Romans, she represented the ideal virtues of honor, loyalty, and modesty. Her reputation quickly became the center of the story that followed. Among the men present that evening was Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son. According to Roman tradition, he became obsessed with Lucretia's beauty and virtue. Several days later, he secretly returned to her home while her husband was away. Threatening violence and disgrace, Sextus forced himself upon her before fleeing into the night. The following day, Lucretia summoned her husband, her father, and several trusted friends. When they arrived, she told them exactly what had happened. They assured her that she had committed no wrongdoing, insisting that the crime belonged entirely to the man who had attacked her. Yet Lucretia believed that although she carried no guilt, she could not continue living beneath the shadow of such dishonor. After demanding that those gathered swear revenge against Sextus Tarquinius and the royal family, she drew a knife and took her own life. To modern audiences, her decision can be difficult to understand. Ancient Roman ideas about honor, family reputation, and personal virtue differed profoundly from our own. Historians continue to examine the story carefully, recognizing that later Roman writers may have shaped or dramatized parts of the account for political purposes. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as described remains uncertain. What is certain is the enormous influence the story held over Roman memory. Lucretia became a symbol, not only of personal virtue, but of resistance against tyranny. Among those present after her death was a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus. Until that moment, Brutus had reportedly concealed much of his intelligence, pretending to be harmless in order to survive under Tarquin's increasingly suspicious rule. Now, standing beside Lucretia's body, he removed the knife from her wound, raised it before those gathered, and swore an oath that would echo throughout Roman history. Never again, he declared, would Rome be ruled by a king. The oath spread quickly through the city. Outrage replaced fear. Citizens who had quietly accepted Tarquin's rule suddenly found themselves united by a common cause. Noble families, ordinary Romans, soldiers, and political leaders rallied behind Brutus, demanding that the royal family leave the city. Tarquin attempted to reclaim his throne. He failed. The gates of Rome closed against him. The monarchy, according to Roman tradition, ended in 509 BC. For more than 2 centuries, Rome had been ruled by kings. From that moment forward, it never would be again, at least not officially. Ironically, although Romans came to despise the word king, they remained perfectly willing to grant extraordinary power to individuals under different titles. History has a wonderful sense of humor like that. Sometimes changing the name feels easier than changing the system. Still, the fall of the monarchy marked one of the most important turning points in Roman history. Instead of placing authority in the hands of a single ruler, Rome began experimenting with something remarkably different. Power would now be divided. Leaders would hold office for limited terms. Magistrates would share responsibilities. The Senate would play a far greater role. The system would be imperfect, sometimes frustrating, frequently chaotic, and occasionally it would seem as though the Romans had invented entirely new ways to argue with one another. But despite all of its flaws, this new form of government would endure for nearly 5 centuries. It would guide Rome through wars, victories, disasters, and astonishing expansion. The city that had once been ruled by kings was about to become a republic, and with that change, Rome's rise would truly begin. When the last king was driven from Rome in 509 BC, the city celebrated what seemed like the beginning of a new era. No more kings, no more royal families, no more single ruler whose word stood above everyone else's. At least, that was the plan. The Romans had no intention of replacing one king with another. Instead, they attempted something few civilizations had ever tried on such a scale. They built a government designed around the idea that power should never remain in one person's hands for too long. It wasn't democracy in the modern sense, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it represented a remarkable experiment in sharing authority. Of course, creating a new government on paper is much easier than persuading thousands of people to make it work. The morning after the monarchy ended, most Romans still woke before sunrise. Farmers still walked to their fields. Blacksmiths still lit their furnaces. Bakers still kneaded dough while the city remained wrapped in the cool light of dawn. Goats, displaying their usual complete disregard for political revolutions, continued wandering wherever they pleased. Life, as it often does, carried on. That's something history books sometimes forget to mention. Political revolutions may change governments overnight, but they rarely change ordinary life by breakfast. Most people were less concerned with constitutional reforms than they were with whether enough rain had fallen to help the crops. Even so, something fundamental had changed. The people who governed Rome would no longer inherit power simply because they were born into the right family. Instead, Rome introduced a system of elected magistrates. The most important of these officials were 2 men known as consuls. Every year, Roman citizens elected two consuls who served together, each possessing the authority to block the other's decisions. It may sound inefficient, and occasionally it certainly was, but inefficiency was partly the point. The Romans had learned a painful lesson from their kings. One powerful leader could become dangerous. Two leaders forced to cooperate were much less likely to become tyrants. Well, that was the theory. Sometimes the consuls worked remarkably well together. Other times they probably looked at each other across a meeting and silently wondered if exile might be preferable. Power, however, did not belong solely to the consuls. The Senate became increasingly important, serving as Rome's most influential advisory body. Its members were generally drawn from Rome's wealthiest and most experienced families, men who had spent years in public service and were expected to guide the Republic through difficult decisions. Officially, the Senate advised rather than ruled. Unofficially, its advice carried an impressive amount of weight. If the consuls represented Rome's executive leadership, the Senate became something closer to the city's long-term memory. Senators debated foreign policy, finances, military campaigns, religious matters, and public construction. Discussions could continue for hours, sometimes days, with passionate speeches filling public buildings while citizens gathered outside waiting to hear the outcome. Roman politics was rarely quiet. If you've ever watched two people argue over where to eat dinner, you've already witnessed a surprisingly accurate introduction to political compromise. Simply imagine replacing pizza with the future of an expanding republic. Not every Roman, however, enjoyed the same political influence. Society remained divided into two broad groups. The patricians were Rome's traditional aristocratic families. They controlled much of the land, held considerable wealth, and dominated many government offices during the Republic's earliest years. Their ancestors claimed connections to the city's oldest families, and many believed leadership naturally belonged in their hands. Then there were the plebeians, everyone else: farmers, craftsmen, merchants, builders, laborers, soldiers. The overwhelming majority of Rome's population belonged to this group. Plebeians paid taxes. Plebeians fought Rome's wars. Plebeians built Rome's roads, homes, workshops, and markets. Yet many possessed little influence over the government, making decisions that shaped their lives. It didn't take long for that imbalance to create tension. Imagine spending months serving in the army, risking your life defending the Republic, only to return home and discover your debts had grown larger, while wealthy landowners seemed to grow richer every year. That wasn't simply frustrating, it became a political problem. Still, despite these divisions, Rome possessed something many neighboring cities lacked: an extraordinary willingness to adapt. When serious problems emerged, the Romans argued. They debated, they negotiated. Occasionally they shouted. Quite often they compromised. Not because everyone suddenly became friends, but because preserving the Republic mattered more than allowing disagreements to destroy it. That instinct, to adjust rather than collapse, would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. It certainly didn't solve every crisis. Far from it. In fact, the Republic's first decades would be filled with challenges that threatened its very survival. Enemies surrounded Rome. Former allies questioned its new government. Even the exiled king refused to accept defeat. The Republic had barely taken its first steps. Already, it was being tested. The newly formed Republic had survived its first political transition, but surviving and thriving are two very different things. The Romans had removed their king. Now they had to prove they could govern themselves. That task became considerably more difficult when word spread across Italy that Rome's monarchy had fallen. Neighboring cities watched closely, some with curiosity, others with quiet satisfaction. A government in transition often appears vulnerable, and throughout history, few opportunities have tempted ambitious rivals more than the chance to challenge a nation that seems distracted by its own internal affairs. Among those unwilling to accept Rome's new government was the man who had just lost everything: Tarquin the Proud. According to Roman tradition, the former king refused to disappear quietly. Instead, he traveled among neighboring rulers, seeking allies willing to help restore him to the throne. He argued that Rome had betrayed its rightful king and that the Republic would collapse without strong leadership. Whether his speeches were persuasive or simply convenient for Rome's enemies, several communities agreed to support him. The Republic would face its first major test far sooner than anyone hoped. For ordinary Romans, however, politics remained only one part of daily life. The sun still rose over the 7 hills. Markets still filled with merchants arranging baskets of olives, grain, vegetables, pottery, and freshly baked bread. Shepherds guided flocks through the countryside while fishermen cast nets into the Tiber before dawn. Blacksmiths worked glowing iron into plows, nails, spearheads, and horseshoes, each ringing strike of the hammer echoing through narrow streets that grew busier with every passing year. Children, meanwhile, continued doing what children have always done. They played, they chased stray dogs. They invented games with sticks, stones, and entirely too much confidence. Some undoubtedly found creative ways to avoid chores before being reminded that Roman parents had already mastered the phrase, "I asked you to do this an hour ago." Certain traditions truly are timeless, yet beneath these ordinary routines, the Republic demanded something extraordinary from its citizens: participation. Rome's survival depended not on a king giving orders, but on thousands of individuals accepting responsibility for their community. Farmers became soldiers when called upon. Wealthy citizens funded military equipment. Magistrates served limited terms before returning to private life. Religious leaders performed ceremonies believed necessary to maintain the favor of the gods. Every role, however different, contributed to the stability of the Republic. It created a powerful idea. Rome belonged to its citizens, not to a single family, not to one ruler, to the Republic itself. That sense of shared responsibility became one of Rome's greatest strengths. Citizens often disagreed passionately about politics, laws, and military campaigns, but many also believed that protecting the Republic outweighed personal ambition. It was an ideal that inspired remarkable loyalty, even if reality occasionally struggled to keep pace with it. Military service reflected this philosophy perfectly. Rome still did not maintain the massive professional army it would later become famous for. Instead, citizens were expected to answer the call whenever danger threatened. A farmer might spend spring planting crops, summer defending the Republic, and autumn returning home just in time for harvest. There were no elaborate uniforms or permanent military careers for most soldiers during these early years. The army was, in many ways, simply Rome itself, neighbors standing beside neighbors, brothers beside brothers, fathers beside sons. Victory or defeat affected everyone because everyone had something at stake. According to Roman tradition, one of the Republic's earliest triumphs came when Tarquin attempted to reclaim his throne with the support of the Etruscan king Lars Porsena. Ancient accounts differ considerably on exactly what happened, making it difficult for modern historians to separate legend from historical reality. Some stories suggest Rome resisted heroically. Others imply negotiations played a larger role than later Roman writers cared to admit. As often happens with ancient history, the truth probably lies somewhere between the two. The Romans naturally preferred the more dramatic version. Their histories became filled with courageous individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the Republic. Horatius Cocles supposedly defended a bridge almost single-handedly, while fellow Romans destroyed it behind him. Gaius Mucius Scaevola reportedly thrust his own hand into a fire to demonstrate his courage after a failed attempt to assassinate an enemy king. Cloelia, a young Roman hostage, was said to have escaped captivity by swimming across the Tiber with a group of children. Did every event happen exactly as later writers described? Probably not. Did those stories reveal the values Romans admired? Absolutely. Courage, discipline, self-sacrifice, determination. Again and again, Roman historians celebrated individuals who placed the Republic above themselves. Whether completely factual or partly legendary, these tales became moral lessons taught to generations of Roman children. Long before they learned military tactics or political philosophy, young Romans learned that honor often required courage when circumstances became difficult. As the years passed, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Republic had survived. It had faced internal uncertainty. It had resisted external threats. Its government, though imperfect, continued functioning. And perhaps most importantly, Romans were beginning to trust it. That confidence changed the city's ambitions. No longer was Rome simply trying to survive from one generation to the next. It began looking beyond its own walls, neighboring towns, nearby tribes, strategic river crossings, fertile farmland. Every opportunity and every threat started to matter. The Republic was becoming stronger, more organized, more confident. It had weathered its first storm. Now it was preparing to expand. Before long, Rome would find itself locked in nearly constant conflict with the peoples surrounding central Italy, fighting not for glory or empire, but simply for the right to exist. Those struggles would transform a small republic into the dominant power of the Italian peninsula, and they would mark the true beginning of Rome's long road toward empire. The Roman Republic had survived its uncertain beginning. The kings were gone. The new government remained standing. The city continued to grow, its markets becoming busier each year, and its influence stretching a little farther across central Italy. For the first time, many Romans began to believe that perhaps the Republic was not merely an experiment. Perhaps it was built to last. History, however, has an unfortunate habit of testing confidence the moment it appears. Rome did not exist in an empty landscape waiting to be conquered. Every hill, river, forest, and fertile valley already belonged to someone else. Latin tribes lived nearby. The Sabines occupied neighboring lands. Powerful Etruscan cities remained to the north, while mountain peoples such as the Aequi and Volsci frequently descended from the hills in search of land, livestock, or supplies. Beyond them stood dozens of independent communities, each protecting its own interests and watching Rome with increasing suspicion. To Rome's neighbors, the Republic's rapid growth was becoming difficult to ignore. One successful harvest could be dismissed as luck. One military victory could be explained away. But year after year, Rome became a little stronger, a little wealthier, and a little more organized. Eventually, someone was going to try to stop it. For ordinary Romans, these growing tensions were impossible to escape. Military service had become woven into daily life. A young farmer might spend weeks preparing fields for planting, only to hear that enemy forces had crossed into Roman territory. Without hesitation, he would leave his crops behind, collect his shield and spear, kiss his family goodbye, and march alongside neighbors who had done exactly the same thing. The Republic did not have the luxury of choosing between farming and fighting. It had to do both. That balancing act demanded remarkable discipline. If too many men remained home, Rome could lose a battle. If too many marched away, fields might go unharvested, and families could face hunger by winter. Every military campaign carried hidden costs that stretched far beyond the battlefield. In many ways, Rome's earliest victories were won as much by endurance as by strategy. The Roman army of this period looked very different from the famous legions most people imagine today. Soldiers purchased much of their own equipment according to their wealth. A prosperous landowner might arrive wearing bronze armor with a polished helmet, large shield, and sturdy spear. A poorer citizen often carried simpler equipment, relying more heavily on determination than expensive protection. Standing together, they formed an army whose appearance reflected the society it defended. There was no standard uniform, no identical armor, no perfectly organized ranks stretching across the countryside. Those refinements would come later. For now, Rome's greatest advantage wasn't superior equipment, it was persistence. Roman armies developed a reputation that frustrated many opponents. Defeat rarely convinced them to surrender. If one army was destroyed, another was assembled. If a campaign failed, preparations for the next began almost immediately. Again and again, Rome absorbed losses that might have broken other cities before returning to the field with renewed determination. The Romans possessed a stubbornness that bordered on legendary. Sometimes that stubbornness was admirable. Occasionally it was exhausting. Usually it was both. The Republic's citizens believed they were fighting for something larger than individual victories. Every battle defended their homes, their families, their farms, and the government they had built together after overthrowing the monarchy. Losing a war meant risking everything they had spent generations creating. That conviction made retreat psychologically difficult. When defeat came, and it certainly did from time to time, it was viewed not as the end of the struggle, but as a lesson to be studied before trying again. Many neighboring peoples found this deeply irritating. Imagine defeating the same opponent, only to discover they intended to return next year with another army, and the year after that. Eventually, even Rome's enemies began recognizing a simple truth. The Republic was incredibly difficult to discourage. While wars occupied much of the Republic's attention, life inside the city continued evolving. Markets expanded into lively gathering places where merchants sold grain, olives, wine, livestock, pottery, fabrics, and tools from sunrise until late afternoon. The smell of fresh bread drifted through crowded streets while craftsmen displayed bronze lamps, iron knives, leather sandals, and brightly painted ceramics imported from distant regions. Visitors arriving in Rome would have heard an endless mixture of sounds: hammers striking metal, merchants negotiating prices, children laughing as they darted between crowded stalls, donkeys objecting loudly to nearly every task assigned to them. Some things transcend every civilization. Even as trade flourished, the Republic never forgot the importance of agriculture. Most Romans still lived close to the land, and successful harvests determined whether communities prospered or struggled through the coming winter. Festivals honoring Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, reminded citizens that no military victory mattered very much if there wasn't enough food waiting when the soldiers returned home. Religion remained intertwined with every success and every setback. Before armies marched, sacrifices were offered. Before elections, priests observed sacred rituals. Before major decisions, leaders sought favorable omens from the gods. Modern readers sometimes imagine these ceremonies as separate from politics or military affairs, but to the Romans, they were inseparable. Divine favor was considered every bit as important as careful planning. As the Republic expanded, another realization slowly began taking shape. Rome could no longer think only about defending itself. Each victory brought new territory, new allies, new responsibilities, and sometimes new enemies. The city that had once fought merely to survive was beginning to discover that success created challenges almost as dangerous as failure. Before long, one conflict in particular would reshape Rome forever. It would last for generations. It would test the Republic's resilience more severely than ever before. And by the time it finally ended, Rome would stand as the undisputed master of nearly the entire Italian peninsula. The road to empire, though no one realized it yet, had truly begun. By the early 4th century BC, Rome was no longer just another city competing for survival. It had become a rising regional power. That success brought wealth, influence, and new allies, but it also guaranteed something else: larger enemies. Every victory pushed Rome's borders farther outward, placing the Republic in contact with peoples who had their own histories, ambitions, and reasons for resisting Roman expansion. The Republic rarely set out believing it would one day rule Italy. More often, one conflict led to another, each victory creating fresh responsibilities that eventually demanded another campaign. Expansion was less like following a carefully drawn map and more like walking through a doorway, only to discover another waiting beyond it. One of Rome's greatest rivals during this period was the Samnites. The Samnites lived in the rugged mountains of southern Italy, where steep valleys and rocky hills produced people known for their toughness and independence. They were not united under a single king, but organized into tribal communities that could quickly gather skilled warriors whenever danger appeared. Unlike the flatter lands surrounding Rome, Samnite territory favored surprise attacks, narrow mountain passes, and intimate knowledge of difficult terrain. The Romans respected them. They also underestimated them. The conflict that followed, remembered as the Samnite Wars, stretched across decades rather than years. It was not one continuous campaign, but a series of wars interrupted by uneasy periods of peace, shifting alliances, and preparations for the next inevitable confrontation. Entire generations of Romans grew up knowing little else. Young boys watched their fathers march off to war, only to become soldiers themselves before the struggle finally ended. Few conflicts shaped the Roman military more profoundly. One of the Republic's darkest moments came in 321 BC at a place known as the Caudine Forks. A Roman army entered a narrow mountain pass, believing it could advance safely. Instead, it found every escape route blocked. The Samnites had anticipated their movements perfectly. Towering hills surrounded the trapped soldiers, while enemy warriors controlled every possible exit. The Romans searched desperately for a way through, but quickly realized there wasn't one. Charging uphill meant certain destruction. Remaining where they were only delayed the inevitable. For perhaps the first time since the Republic's founding, Roman determination alone could not solve the problem. The army surrendered. The terms imposed by the Samnites wounded Roman pride far more deeply than the military defeat itself. According to ancient accounts, Roman soldiers were required to lay down their weapons and pass beneath a wooden yoke constructed from crossed spears, a ritual symbolizing complete submission and humiliation. No blood was shed during the ceremony, yet many Romans remembered it as one of the most painful moments in their history. Defeat on the battlefield could eventually be redeemed. Humiliation lingered. If you've ever spent days replaying an embarrassing moment in your mind that everyone else forgot within minutes, you'll understand something about the Roman response. Only multiply that feeling by an entire republic. Rome did not seek revenge immediately. Instead, it did something that would become one of its defining characteristics. It learned. Roman commanders studied what had gone wrong. Fighting in rigid formations through narrow mountain terrain had proven disastrous. Future armies would need greater flexibility, better organization, and the ability to adapt quickly when conditions changed. Over time, these hard-earned lessons contributed to the development of military tactics that made Roman legions among the most effective fighting forces of the ancient world. Failure became a teacher rather than a final chapter. That mindset appeared again and again throughout Roman history. Lose a battle. Study the mistakes. Improve. Return stronger. It sounds simple. Living through it was considerably less enjoyable. As the wars continued, Rome gradually gained the upper hand. New roads allowed armies to move more quickly across Italy. Colonies established in conquered territories strengthened Roman influence while providing secure bases for future campaigns. Alliances expanded, and many communities discovered that cooperation with Rome often brought protection, trade, and opportunities that constant warfare could not. Not every alliance was formed willingly. History is rarely so polite. Still, Rome developed an unusual approach toward conquered peoples. Instead of destroying every defeated community, the Republic frequently offered varying degrees of citizenship, local self-government, or military partnership. The exact arrangements differed from place to place, but this willingness to absorb former rivals rather than eliminate them allowed Rome's strength to grow with each victory. The Republic was building something larger than an empire of occupied cities. It was constructing a network, road by road, treaty by treaty, generation by generation. By the time the Samnite Wars finally drew to a close, Rome stood in a position few could have imagined a century earlier. Most of central and much of southern Italy now acknowledged Roman leadership. The Republic possessed experienced armies, seasoned commanders, expanding trade routes, and growing confidence in its own institutions. It had become the dominant power on the Italian peninsula. For many Romans, this seemed like the reward for generations of sacrifice. At last, perhaps, peace could finally arrive. History, however, had one more surprise waiting just beyond the horizon. Across the sea, another republic had also been growing stronger. It possessed immense wealth, a powerful navy, brilliant commanders, and ambitions every bit as great as Rome's. Before long, the Mediterranean would become too small for both of them. The name of that rival was Carthage. And the struggle between these two rising powers would produce one of the greatest conflicts the ancient world had ever seen. For nearly 2 centuries, Rome had fought its way from a modest city on the banks of the Tiber to the dominant power of the Italian peninsula. It had survived kings, civil unrest, mountain tribes, powerful neighboring cities, and generations of nearly constant warfare. Many Romans believed the Republic had finally reached a point where it could enjoy the rewards of its hard-earned security. Instead, they found themselves staring across the sea. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly beyond Italy's western coast, its deep blue waters connecting dozens of civilizations through trade, exploration, and war. Merchant ships carrying grain, olive oil, timber, precious metals, and fine pottery crisscrossed its surface every day. To ancient peoples, the Mediterranean was not a barrier separating nations. It was the ancient world's busiest highway, and one nation controlled much of that highway better than anyone else. Carthage, located on the northern coast of Africa near present-day Tunisia, Carthage had grown from a Phoenician trading colony into one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Its harbors welcomed ships from Spain, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. Gold, silver, ivory, spices, wine, textiles, and countless other goods flowed through its markets. While Rome had spent centuries mastering land warfare, Carthage had become the undisputed queen of the sea. Its navy was legendary. Its merchants sailed farther than almost anyone else. Its wealth seemed almost limitless. Imagine arriving in Carthage as a traveler from central Italy. Instead of narrow streets winding between simple stone homes, you would encounter broad avenues crowded with merchants speaking dozens of different languages. Massive warehouses lined the harbor. Elegant homes overlooked busy ports where hundreds of ships loaded and unloaded cargo from every corner of the Mediterranean. Exotic goods that many Romans had only heard described could be found in Carthaginian marketplaces almost any day of the week. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Rome admired it. Rome envied it. Eventually, Rome feared it. The two republics actually shared several surprising similarities. Neither was ruled by a king. Both relied upon wealthy elites to guide political decisions. Both valued commerce. Both expected citizens to contribute to military service. Both believed their civilization represented the future. Perhaps that was precisely the problem. History often remembers conflicts between nations with obvious differences. But some of the fiercest rivalries emerge between societies that resemble one another far more than either side cares to admit. For years, Rome and Carthage managed an uneasy peace. Treaties established trading rights and recognized spheres of influence across the Western Mediterranean. Neither government seemed eager to begin a war whose outcome was impossible to predict. Then, Sicily complicated everything. The large island resting between Italy and North Africa occupied one of the most strategically valuable locations in the ancient world. Whoever influenced Sicily gained access to important trade routes connecting east and west. Fertile farmland supplied enormous quantities of grain, while prosperous Greek cities, local kingdoms, and competing powers all sought influence there. Control of Sicily promised tremendous rewards. It also invited tremendous danger. The crisis began in the city of Messana, where a group of mercenary soldiers known as the Mamertines seized control and soon found themselves threatened by neighboring forces. Desperate for protection, they reached out for help. Remarkably, they asked both Rome and Carthage. It was rather like inviting two rival neighbors to settle an argument over your fence, only to discover they had brought entire armies. Neither great power wanted the other establishing permanent influence on Sicily. Roman leaders worried that Carthaginian forces stationed just across the narrow Strait of Messina could eventually threaten southern Italy itself. Carthage, meanwhile, viewed Roman involvement as an alarming expansion beyond the Italian mainland. Suspicion quickly replaced diplomacy. In Rome, the Senate debated the situation intensely. Intervening carried enormous risks. Ignoring Sicily carried perhaps even greater ones. Some senators argued that crossing into Sicily would drag the Republic into an unnecessary overseas conflict unlike anything Rome had attempted before. Others warned that allowing Carthage complete control of the island might one day place a hostile superpower directly at Rome's doorstep. Neither option appeared attractive. Sometimes the most difficult decisions are not choosing between good and bad. They're choosing between two different kinds of danger. Eventually, the Republic made its choice. Roman soldiers crossed the narrow waters separating Italy from Sicily. With that single decision, Rome entered a conflict unlike any it had ever fought. The Republic possessed experienced armies capable of defeating nearly anyone on land. Carthage possessed the strongest navy in the Western Mediterranean. Each power excelled exactly where the other was weakest. The stage was set for one of history's greatest rivalries, a struggle that would last for more than a century, a struggle that would produce some of the ancient world's greatest military innovations. And eventually, a commander whose name would strike fear into generations of Romans. His story had not yet begun. But before Hannibal would march toward Rome, the Republic first had to learn how to fight an enemy that ruled the sea. When the First Punic War began in 264 BC, Rome faced a challenge unlike anything it had encountered before. For centuries, the Republic had perfected the art of fighting on land. Roman armies marched across valleys, climbed mountain passes, and built fortified camps with remarkable efficiency. Their soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to adapting after every setback. There was just one problem. The war would largely be decided at sea. That was Carthage's domain. Its fleets had patrolled the western Mediterranean for generations. Carthaginian sailors learned navigation from childhood. Their shipbuilders constructed sleek warships capable of remarkable speed and maneuverability, while experienced captains understood the unpredictable moods of the sea, as well as Roman generals understood the hills of Italy. Rome, by comparison, possessed very little naval tradition. If you had asked many Roman citizens to identify the difference between various classes of warships, they might have stared politely before pointing toward the water and saying, "That one floats." Yet the Republic had never been discouraged by inexperience. It simply viewed unfamiliar problems as opportunities to learn. According to ancient tradition, the Romans captured or recovered a stranded Carthaginian warship early in the conflict. Engineers carefully examined every beam, every joint, every oar, and every sail. They measured its dimensions with astonishing precision before setting about constructing an entire fleet based upon what they had learned. Some historians debate exactly how this process unfolded. What matters is the larger truth. Rome was exceptionally good at studying successful ideas and making them its own. The Republic had borrowed from the Etruscans. It had learned from the Greeks. Now it intended to learn from Carthage. Within a surprisingly short time, Roman shipyards echoed with the sounds of axes, saws, hammers, and shouting foremen trying to coordinate thousands of workers. Forests supplied timber, blacksmiths forged iron fittings, rope makers twisted endless lengths of cordage, while carpenters transformed stacks of lumber into towering warships. The scale of the effort was extraordinary. Building a navy from almost nothing would have seemed impossible to many civilizations. To Rome, it became another engineering problem waiting to be solved. Training the crews, however, proved considerably more difficult. Experienced sailors cannot simply be created overnight. Thousands of recruits had spent their lives farming fields rather than navigating open water. Ancient writers even describe men practicing rowing while their ships remained on land, learning to move their oars together before ever launching into the sea. The image is almost charming. Hundreds of future sailors sitting in wooden ships that weren't actually in the water, rowing together across dry ground while instructors shouted commands. Every expert, after all, begins as a beginner. The Romans understood that they could never hope to outsail Carthage overnight. So they asked themselves a different question. What if they didn't have to? Instead of trying to become better sailors, perhaps they could turn naval battles into something they already understood: land battles. Their answer became one of the most ingenious military inventions of the ancient world: a boarding bridge called the corvus, meaning the raven. The device consisted of a long wooden bridge fitted with a heavy iron spike underneath. As enemy ships drew close, Roman sailors dropped the bridge onto the opposing vessel. The iron spike dug into the enemy deck, locking both ships together. At that moment, the battle changed completely. Roman infantry charged across the bridge with shields raised and swords drawn. The graceful naval duel that Carthage expected suddenly became a brutal infantry fight fought on floating platforms. It was as though Rome had quietly picked up a section of dry land and carried it out into the middle of the Mediterranean. The strategy worked astonishingly well. One of the earliest and most famous demonstrations came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. There, the Roman fleet, commanded by Gaius Duilius, defeated a more experienced Carthaginian navy by repeatedly using the corvus to seize enemy ships. Carthaginian captains, accustomed to winning through superior seamanship, suddenly found themselves facing heavily armed Roman soldiers pouring across wooden bridges. It was something they had never encountered before. The victory electrified Rome. For the first time, the Republic had proven it could challenge Carthage on the sea as well as the land. Celebrations filled the city. Temples offered thanks to the gods. Veterans returned home carrying stories that sounded almost unbelievable. Rome had built a navy, then used it to defeat the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean. It seemed almost impossible. Of course, success rarely arrived without complications. The Corvus made Roman ships heavier and less stable in rough seas. Several fleets were later devastated by violent storms, and ancient historians record the loss of tens of thousands of sailors as ships capsized or broke apart in unforgiving weather. The sea, unlike any human enemy, cared nothing for courage, discipline, or clever inventions. Nature remained undefeated. Even so, the Republic refused to abandon the struggle. Again and again, Rome rebuilt its fleets. Again and again, Carthage assembled new armies and new ships. The war dragged on year after exhausting year. Children born when the conflict began grew into adults before it finally approached its conclusion. For many people on both sides, peace became something remembered rather than experienced. Neither republic could afford to lose. Both believed the future of their civilization depended upon victory. Eventually, after more than 20 years of relentless fighting, Rome gained the upper hand. In 241 BC, the decisive Battle of the Aegae's Islands shattered Carthage's remaining hopes of controlling Sicily. Exhausted and facing enormous financial strain, Carthage sued for peace. The First Punic War was over. Rome emerged victorious. Sicily became the Republic's first overseas province, marking the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history. No longer was Rome simply an Italian power. It had become a Mediterranean power. But beneath the peace, resentment smoldered. Carthage had lost ships, territory, prestige, and an enormous fortune in war reparations. Many Carthaginians accepted the treaty because they had no choice. Very few accepted it in their hearts. Somewhere in Carthage, a young boy was growing up listening to stories of defeat, stories of Roman ambition, stories of a republic that had humiliated his homeland. His father would soon make him swear an oath that history would never forget. The boy's name was Hannibal. When the First Punic War finally ended in 241 BC, both Rome and Carthage were exhausted. The conflict had lasted 23 years. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but war. Thousands of ships rested at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost. Fortunes had disappeared, and families on both sides had spent decades waiting for fathers, sons, and brothers to return home. Peace, at last, seemed welcome. But peace has a curious way of planting the seeds of the next conflict. Rome emerged from the war stronger than ever before. Sicily became its first overseas province, soon followed by Sardinia and Corsica. Trade expanded. Tax revenue increased. Victorious generals returned to cheering crowds, while merchants eagerly looked toward new opportunities beyond Italy. The Republic was becoming something entirely new. Not merely a city that controlled neighboring lands, not merely the dominant power of Italy. Rome was beginning to think like an empire, even if no one yet used that word. Across the sea, however, the mood could not have been more different. Carthage had survived, but survival carried a heavy price. The enormous indemnity demanded by Rome strained the city's finances for years. Its once proud navy had been reduced. Political disagreements divided its leadership, while unrest spread among unpaid mercenary soldiers who had fought bravely during the war only to discover there was little money left to reward them. The result was a brutal conflict historians now call the Mercenary War. Former soldiers turned against the very nation they had served. Cities rebelled. Countryside burned. For several terrifying years, Carthage found itself fighting for its own survival. Rome watched carefully. Some Roman leaders considered taking advantage of Carthage's weakness, arguing that future threats should be eliminated before they could recover. Others believed the Republic had already gained enough. In the end, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica while Carthage struggled to restore order, a decision that left deep resentment among many Carthaginians. To them, it felt less like diplomacy and more like opportunism. If you've ever been knocked down only to have someone reach into your pocket while you're trying to stand back up, you'll understand why Carthage never forgot this moment. Among those paying close attention was one of Carthage's most respected military leaders, Hamilcar Barca. The surname Barca likely meant lightning, an appropriate description for a commander known for boldness and determination. During the First Punic War, Hamilcar had earned a reputation as one of Carthage's finest generals, admired by his soldiers even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He understood something many politicians did not. Defeating Rome would require more than rebuilding a fleet. Carthage needed wealth, resources, experienced soldiers, a new foundation from which to recover. His answer lay across the sea in the Iberian Peninsula. Today we know it as Spain. Rich silver mines, fertile farmland, thriving trade routes, and numerous local tribes made Iberia one of the most valuable regions in the Western Mediterranean. If Carthage could establish itself there, it might one day regain the strength lost during the First Punic War. So Hamilcar crossed into Iberia and began building something remarkable. Not merely an army, an entire power base. Over the following years, Carthaginian influence spread steadily across the peninsula. New alliances formed, cities were established, wealth flowed back toward North Africa, helping repair Carthage's damaged economy. Experienced veterans trained fresh recruits, while talented young officers learned their craft under seasoned commanders. One of those boys often accompanied Hamilcar, his son, Hannibal. Ancient historians preserve a story that became one of the most famous scenes in Roman history. According to tradition, before departing for Spain, Hamilcar brought the young Hannibal to a sacred altar. There, he asked his son to place his hand upon the sacrifice and swear eternal hostility toward Rome. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers described is impossible to know. Ancient authors occasionally enjoyed improving a good story. Even so, the tale captured something important. From childhood, Hannibal grew up surrounded by memories of defeat. He heard veterans describe the First Punic War. He watched his father rebuild Carthaginian power from the ground up. He learned that Rome had not merely defeated Carthage, Rome had humiliated it. Children often inherit more than their parents' possessions. Sometimes they inherit unfinished struggles. As Hannibal matured, he displayed extraordinary intelligence, remarkable courage, and an ability to inspire fierce loyalty among soldiers from many different cultures. Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, Libyans, and Phoenicians all eventually served under his command, forming one of the most diverse armies the ancient world had ever seen. Winning the trust of people who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and came from different traditions required exceptional leadership. Hannibal possessed it in abundance. Meanwhile, Rome continued expanding almost without interruption. Roads stretched farther across Italy, allowing armies, merchants, and messages to travel with increasing speed. Colonies secured newly conquered territories, while engineers built bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications that reflected the Republic's growing confidence. To many Romans, the future appeared bright, perhaps brighter than it truly was, because while the Senate celebrated victories and merchants counted profits, a young commander was quietly preparing for the conflict that would define his life. He wasn't building ships. He wasn't waiting for Rome to attack first. He was studying maps, mountain ranges, river crossings, supply routes, and one impossible idea that no Roman believed any enemy would ever attempt. If war returned, Hannibal had no intention of arriving by sea. He would choose a path so bold that even centuries later, people would still struggle to believe it had really happened. In 221 BC, after years of campaigning in Iberia, Hannibal Barca became commander of the Carthaginian army. He was only in his mid-20s. Many Roman politicians likely viewed him as another ambitious foreign general, talented perhaps, but hardly different from the many commanders Rome had faced before. History would soon prove otherwise. Hannibal possessed an unusual gift for understanding not only battles, but people. His soldiers came from many different cultures and spoke many different languages, yet they followed him with extraordinary loyalty. Ancient writers describe him sharing hardships alongside his men, eating the same food, sleeping outdoors, enduring the same freezing nights and scorching summers. Leadership, he believed, was earned, not inherited, not purchased, earned. Meanwhile, Rome watched Carthaginian activity in Spain with growing concern. The Republic had signed treaties limiting expansion, hoping to preserve an uneasy peace. For a time, those agreements held. Then the city of Saguntum changed everything. Located south of the Ebro River, Saguntum maintained friendly relations with Rome despite lying within Carthage's growing sphere of influence. Tensions escalated until Hannibal eventually laid siege to the city. The siege lasted for months. Its defenders resisted with remarkable determination, but eventually the walls were breached. Saguntum fell, and news traveled rapidly across the Mediterranean. Roman ambassadors demanded that Carthage surrender Hannibal. Carthage refused. Diplomacy had reached its end. In 218 BC, the Second Punic War began. The Roman Senate assumed they understood what would happen next. Carthage would rebuild its navy. The war would be fought across the sea. Roman fleets would intercept enemy forces before they reached Italy. It seemed like the obvious strategy. It was also completely wrong. Instead of assembling a massive invasion fleet, Hannibal gathered an army in Spain and marched north. Thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, supply wagons, engineers, camp followers, and perhaps most famously, 37 war elephants. Even today, that number captures the imagination. The image almost sounds fictional, an army marching toward Rome with elephants. Yet ancient historians agree that elephants accompanied Hannibal during the early stages of the campaign. To Roman observers, they must have seemed like creatures from another world. Many soldiers had never seen one before. Now they were being told an entire army was bringing them across Europe. That wasn't even the most astonishing part. Hannibal wasn't heading toward a port. He wasn't searching for ships. He was marching toward the Alps. The Alps form one of Europe's greatest mountain ranges, their towering peaks separating the Italian peninsula from the lands beyond. Even today, crossing them demands careful planning. During the 3rd century BC, with primitive equipment, hostile tribes, freezing temperatures, narrow paths, and thousands of soldiers, the journey bordered on the impossible, which, from Hannibal's perspective, made it perfect. The Romans had spent decades preparing for the wrong invasion. Their armies waited where they expected Carthage to appear. Their fleets patrolled the Mediterranean. Their generals planned campaigns based on familiar assumptions. Hannibal intended to ignore every one of them. The march itself became one of history's greatest military achievements. Ancient sources disagree about the exact route, and historians continue debating which mountain passes Hannibal actually used. What they do agree upon is the immense hardship endured by his army. Steep cliffs claimed men and animals alike. Rock slides blocked narrow trails. Snow-covered dangerous paths where a single misstep could send soldiers tumbling hundreds of feet into icy valleys below. Local mountain tribes attacked whenever opportunities appeared. Food became scarce. Pack animals collapsed from exhaustion. The cold reached men who had spent much of their lives beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Every mile demanded determination. Every day tested survival. Imagine standing in line, carrying heavy equipment, unable to see the end of the column ahead or behind because the winding mountain path disappeared into clouds. The wind howled across jagged peaks while snow gathered beneath your feet. Somewhere ahead, elephants struggled over icy ground. Somewhere behind, friends disappeared into the fog. You had no map, no certainty, only trust that the man leading the army knew where he was going. Remarkably, they kept going, not because the journey became easier, because turning back had become even harder. Weeks later, battered but unbroken, Hannibal's army finally descended into northern Italy. The cost had been staggering. Many soldiers had perished, most of the elephants were weakened, supplies were desperately low. Yet Hannibal had accomplished something the Romans considered impossible. An enemy army now stood inside Italy, not transported by ships, not slipped past the navy. It had simply walked over the mountains. Shock spread throughout the Republic. The Senate scrambled to understand what had happened. Roman commanders rushed north. Citizens who had spent decades believing the Alps served as an impenetrable natural barrier suddenly realized they had been mistaken. The war had arrived on their doorstep, and it was being led by a commander unlike any Rome had ever faced. Over the months ahead, Hannibal would defeat Roman armies again and again, forcing the Republic into one of the darkest periods in its history. The first of those battles was now only days away. At a river called the Ticinus, Rome would receive its first glimpse of the military genius that would make Hannibal's name legendary for more than 2,000 years. When Hannibal descended from the Alps in 218 BC, he arrived with far fewer soldiers than he had started with. The mountains had claimed thousands of lives. Cold, starvation, rockslides, enemy attacks, exhaustion. Every mile had demanded another sacrifice. Yet despite those terrible losses, Hannibal had accomplished the one thing Rome believed impossible. He had brought a foreign army into Italy. The psychological impact was almost as important as the military one. For generations, Romans had viewed the Alps as a natural fortress protecting the Republic from invasion. The towering mountains seemed permanent, immovable, and reassuringly impassable. Now an enemy army stood on the other side. Sometimes the greatest victories occur long before the first battle begins. Rome reacted quickly. The Senate ordered multiple armies into the field, while experienced commanders rushed north to intercept Hannibal before he could gather support among the Celtic tribes living in northern Italy. The Republic still possessed enormous advantages in manpower, wealth, and organization. Most Roman leaders believed the invasion could be crushed before it became a serious threat. After all, Hannibal's army was tired, outnumbered, far from home. Surely the problem would solve itself. It did not. The first clash occurred near the river Ticinus. Rather than committing his entire army, Hannibal relied heavily on one of his greatest strengths, his cavalry. His Numidian horsemen, famous for their speed and remarkable skill, harassed Roman forces with surprising effectiveness. They rode without heavy armor, carrying light spears and small shields while maneuvering with extraordinary agility. Watching them must have been astonishing. They seemed less like individual riders and more like flowing water, constantly moving, circling, and striking wherever opportunities appeared. During the battle, the Roman commander Publius Cornelius Scipio was seriously wounded. According to later tradition, he survived only because his young son courageously rode into the fighting to rescue him. Whether every detail occurred exactly as described remains uncertain, but the boy's name deserves remembering: Scipio. Years later, history would know him as Scipio Africanus, the man destined to defeat Hannibal. For now, however, he was simply a brave young rider saving his father. The Roman defeat at Ticinus was relatively small. It also served as a warning. Hannibal was not behaving like previous enemies. He chose battlefields carefully. He understood terrain. He used cavalry with remarkable precision. Most importantly, he forced Rome to react to him instead of the other way around. Only weeks later came another confrontation: the Battle of the Trebia River. It was December. Winter had settled across northern Italy. Cold rain soaked the countryside while the nearby river flowed icy and fast. Roman soldiers woke before dawn and marched toward Hannibal's position, eager to force a decisive engagement. Many had eaten little breakfast. Some had spent hours standing in freezing weather before the battle even began. Hannibal, meanwhile, had prepared carefully. His own soldiers ate. They rested. They warmed themselves beside fires before taking their positions. It seems like a small difference. It wasn't. Anyone who has ever tried to function on an empty stomach after waking too early knows how quickly energy disappears. Now imagine trying to fight a battle under those conditions. The Romans crossed the freezing Trebia River, water rising to their waists as winter currents stole warmth from their bodies. Armor became heavier. Clothing clung uncomfortably to their skin. Hands stiffened in the cold while shields grew increasingly difficult to grip. By the time they reached the opposite bank, the battle had barely begun. Hannibal had another surprise waiting. Earlier that morning, he had secretly hidden approximately 2,000 soldiers under the command of his younger brother Mago. Concealed among tall grasses and shallow ravines, they waited silently as the main armies collided. Hours passed. The fighting intensified. Roman infantry pressed forward with characteristic determination, believing victory remained within reach. Then, Mago's hidden force attacked from behind. Suddenly, Roman soldiers found enemies appearing where none had existed moments before. Confusion spread rapidly through the ranks. Orders became difficult to hear over the clash of weapons and the growing realization that they had been surrounded. It was a masterpiece of planning. Hannibal hadn't merely defeated the Roman army, he had manipulated it. Every movement, every decision, every expectation. He seemed to know what the Romans would do before they did. By sunset, the Republic had suffered another devastating defeat. Thousands lay dead. Many more were captured. Others escaped only after desperate fighting. Across Italy, word spread with astonishing speed. The invader from Carthage had defeated Rome again. Panic began replacing confidence. Still, the Senate refused to surrender. If anything, the defeats strengthened Roman resolve. The Republic had overcome disasters before. It would do so again, or so they hoped, because Hannibal was only getting started. The following year, he would lure another Roman army into one of the most brilliantly executed ambushes in military history. The battlefield would be the shores of Lake Trasimene, and by the time the morning fog finally lifted, an entire Roman army would have almost ceased to exist. The defeats at the Ticinus and the Trebaia sent a wave of unease through the Roman Republic. Citizens gathered in marketplaces whispering rumors that seemed almost impossible to believe. Veterans who had spent years defeating tribes across Italy now found themselves asking a question that few Romans had ever seriously considered. What if this enemy could not be stopped? Despite the setbacks, Rome did what Rome had always done. The Senate raised new armies. Young men answered the call to service, while blacksmiths worked late into the night producing swords, helmets, spearheads, and shields. Farmers left their fields once again, hoping their families could manage the harvest without them. The Republic had suffered defeats before, and generations of Roman tradition taught that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Hannibal understood that determination as well as anyone. Rather than marching directly toward Rome's massive walls, he continued moving through the Italian countryside, allowing local tribes who resented Roman rule to join his growing army. Every village that welcomed him weakened Rome's influence just a little more. Every new ally provided fresh supplies, additional soldiers, and valuable knowledge of the land ahead. In the spring of 217 BC, another Roman army marched north under the command of the consul Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was eager to restore Roman confidence after the humiliating defeats of the previous year. Many senators believed that a decisive victory would erase Hannibal's momentum and remind Italy why Rome had become the dominant power of the peninsula. Hannibal anticipated exactly that response. He carefully selected the battlefield near Lake Trasimene, one of the largest lakes in central Italy. On one side lay the calm waters of the lake. On the other rose wooded hills that concealed thousands of Carthaginian soldiers. Between them stretched a narrow road that appeared perfectly safe to anyone marching through on a quiet morning. Nature itself became part of Hannibal's battle plan. Ancient historians describe a thick morning fog drifting across the lake as the Roman army entered the narrow corridor. Visibility fell dramatically. Soldiers could see only the men directly ahead of them, while the long columns stretched for miles along the shoreline. Officers struggled to communicate from one end of the army to the other, and many Romans had no idea that enemy forces surrounded them on nearly every hillside. Then the signal was given. From the forests came the sound of war horns echoing through the mist. Carthaginian infantry charged downhill from several directions at once, while cavalry sealed off the few possible escape routes. Roman soldiers scrambled to form defensive lines, but there was almost no room to maneuver. Some units never even realized the full scale of the attack before fighting for their lives. The battle quickly dissolved into chaos. Instead of organized formations meeting on an open field, thousands of small fights erupted simultaneously along the lakeshore. Men shouted orders that disappeared into the fog. Horses panicked, shields collided, Spears splintered. Soldiers who survived one attack often found another enemy force emerging through the mist only moments later. Many Romans were pushed toward the water. Ancient accounts tell of soldiers attempting to swim across the lake while still wearing heavy armor, a desperate decision that rarely ended well. Others fought until they were completely surrounded. By the time the fighting finally ended, an entire Roman army had effectively been destroyed. It remains one of the largest and most successful ambushes in military history. The Republic was stunned. News of the disaster reached Rome with frightening speed. Families crowded the streets, searching for information about fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. Messengers delivered casualty lists that seemed almost endless. Public celebrations disappeared. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. For the first time in generations, many citizens wondered whether Hannibal might actually reach the city itself. Faced with the growing crisis, Rome did something it had rarely done since overthrowing its kings. The Senate appointed a dictator, not in the modern sense of a permanent ruler, but as a temporary emergency office granted extraordinary authority during times of extreme danger. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius quickly recognized what others had failed to understand. Meeting Hannibal in a traditional pitched battle played directly into the Carthaginian commander's strengths. Every time Rome rushed into combat seeking a quick victory, Hannibal found a way to exploit Roman confidence, superior tactics, or favorable terrain. Continuing that pattern would only produce more disasters. So Fabius chose patience. His strategy frustrated nearly everyone. Rather than attacking, he shadowed Hannibal's movements from a safe distance. Roman forces harassed foraging parties, destroyed supplies whenever possible, guarded important strongholds, and avoided major battles. It was a slow, cautious approach that denied Hannibal the decisive victory he wanted, while gradually wearing down his army. Many Romans hated it. Some accused Fabius of cowardice, others mocked him for refusing to fight. Yet Fabius understood something that was difficult for proud republics to accept. Sometimes the bravest decision is refusing to fight the battle your enemy wants. History would eventually remember him by a fitting nickname, the Delayer. For a time, his strategy worked. Hannibal found himself unable to force the decisive confrontation he desired. Supplies became increasingly difficult to replace, while Rome continued raising fresh armies almost faster than he could defeat them. Unfortunately for Fabius, patience is rarely popular. Many senators grew tired of waiting. They believed Rome's honor demanded a decisive victory, not endless caution. Public pressure mounted. Eventually, the Republic abandoned Fabian's strategy and prepared another enormous army to crush Hannibal once and for all. It would become one of the largest forces Rome had ever assembled. The battlefield would be a dusty plain near the small town of Cannae. What happened there would become the greatest military masterpiece of Hannibal's career, and one of the darkest days in all of Roman history. By the summer of 216 BC, Rome had reached its breaking point. In less than 3 years, Hannibal had crossed the Alps, defeated Roman armies at the Ticinus, crushed them at the Trebia, and annihilated another army beside Lake Trasimene. Every attempt to stop the Carthaginian commander had ended in disaster. The cautious strategy of Fabius Maximus had slowed Hannibal's advance, but many Romans viewed patience as little more than surrender by another name. The Republic wanted a victory, not next year, not eventually, now. So Rome assembled one of the largest armies it had ever placed into the field. Ancient sources suggest that roughly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry marched south to confront Hannibal near the small Apulian village of Cannae. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, but everyone agrees on one point. The Roman army was enormous. It dwarfed Hannibal's force. Many senators believed the outcome was already decided. Surely no commander, however gifted, could overcome such overwhelming numbers. Confidence returned to Rome. Families believed the nightmare would soon be over. Veterans prepared for what they expected to be the final battle of the war. Hannibal welcomed the opportunity. The battlefield stretched across a broad, dusty plain beside the Aufidus River. Unlike the narrow passes of the Alps or the mist-covered shores of Lake Trasimene, there would be no hidden ambushes here. Both armies could see one another clearly beneath the summer sun. Everything depended on tactics. Roman commanders arranged their infantry into an unusually deep formation, packing tens of thousands of soldiers together in the hope that sheer weight would smash through Hannibal's center. It was a straightforward plan built upon the Republic's greatest strength: more men, more shields, more momentum. If enough Romans pushed forward together, surely nothing could stand against them. Hannibal looked at the same battlefield and saw something entirely different. He knew he could not overpower Rome head-on, so he decided to let Rome believe it was winning. His center consisted of Spanish and Gallic infantry arranged in a gentle curve that bowed outward toward the Roman line. Behind them stood his most experienced African infantry, positioned slightly farther back on each flank. His cavalry occupied both wings, with elite Numidian horsemen prepared to challenge the Roman riders. To many observers, the formation probably appeared ordinary. It was anything but ordinary. As the battle began, tens of thousands of men surged forward together. The sound must have been almost indescribable. Thousands of sandals pounded against dry earth, while shields collided with a thunderous crash. Spears splintered. Officers shouted commands that disappeared beneath the roar of battle. Dust rose into the hot summer air until parts of the battlefield vanished behind a haze of earth and sweat. The Roman advance worked exactly as expected. At first, their densely packed infantry pushed Hannibal's center backward. The curved Carthaginian line slowly bent inward under the immense pressure, giving the appearance that it was beginning to collapse. Roman soldiers cheered as they drove deeper into the enemy formation. Victory seemed close enough to touch. It was precisely the illusion Hannibal wanted them to see. Step by step, his center yielded without breaking. The outward curve gradually transformed into a shallow pocket that drew the Roman army farther and farther forward. Eager to finish the battle, Roman infantry continued pressing into the opening, unaware that they were marching into a carefully prepared trap. Meanwhile, events on the wings unfolded just as Hannibal had planned. His cavalry attacked with astonishing speed and discipline. On one flank, Carthaginian horsemen overwhelmed the Roman cavalry before turning to assist their Numidian allies on the opposite side. Within a relatively short time, Rome's cavalry had been driven from the battlefield. For the Roman infantry fighting in the center, this development remained almost invisible. Their attention was fixed entirely ahead. Sometimes the greatest danger arrives from the direction no one is watching. As the Roman army pushed deeper into Hannibal's line, the experienced African infantry waiting on both flanks finally moved. Instead of remaining behind the main battle, they wheeled inward with remarkable precision, striking the exposed sides of the densely packed Roman formation. The trap had begun to close. Thousands of Roman soldiers suddenly found enemies attacking from their left and right at the same time. Before they could reorganize, Hannibal's victorious cavalry returned from the rear, charging into the Roman army from behind. Within a matter of hours, one of history's most famous military maneuvers had been completed. The Romans were surrounded, completely, on every side. There was nowhere left to advance, nowhere left to retreat. The largest army the Republic had ever assembled had become a prison of its own making. What followed would echo through Roman history for centuries. By sunset, the fields around Cannae would be covered with the dead, and the Republic would face the single greatest military catastrophe it had ever known. The question was no longer whether Hannibal had won. The question was whether Rome itself could survive. As the ring around the Roman army tightened, the battle transformed into something far more terrible than either side had imagined at sunrise. The Republic's enormous army, which had seemed like an overwhelming advantage only hours earlier, had become its greatest weakness. Tens of thousands of soldiers stood packed so tightly together that many struggled even to lift their swords. Men in the front ranks were pushed forward by the weight of those behind them, while those farther back often had no clear idea what was happening beyond the sea of helmets and shields surrounding them. There was nowhere to escape, no room to maneuver, only pressure from every direction. The Carthaginian line continued closing like the jaws of a trap. Hannibal's African infantry attacked from both flanks with disciplined precision, while his cavalry struck from behind, sealing every remaining route of retreat. Roman officers shouted commands, but their voices disappeared beneath the deafening sounds of thousands of men fighting for survival. Communication collapsed, organization disappeared. The battle became a desperate struggle between individuals rather than coordinated armies. Ancient historians describe the fighting as lasting for hours. Many Roman soldiers never had the opportunity to engage an enemy directly. Instead, they were crushed beneath the relentless pressure of the crowd around them, unable to move forward or backward. Others fought until exhaustion overcame them, surrounded by friends and strangers alike. The summer heat only made conditions worse. Dust filled the air. Armor trapped the heat. The cries of wounded men echoed across the plain, while horses without riders galloped wildly through the battlefield, adding to the confusion. By midday, the ground had become almost impossible to recognize beneath discarded weapons, broken shields, and countless footprints pressed into the dry earth. When the fighting finally ended, the scale of the disaster stunned the ancient world. Modern historians continue debating the exact numbers, but ancient sources claim that somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. Even allowing for exaggeration, the losses were almost certainly catastrophic. Thousands more were captured, while only a fraction of the original army managed to escape. It remains one of the deadliest single-day battles in military history. The Republic had lost senators, consuls, experienced officers, veteran soldiers. Entire generations of military leadership disappeared before sunset. Nearly every Roman family knew someone who never came home. News traveled toward Rome with terrifying speed. Messengers arrived exhausted after riding day and night. As reports spread through the city, panic threatened to overwhelm the population. Families gathered outside public buildings, hoping to find the names of surviving relatives. Mothers waited for sons who would never return. Wives searched endlessly for husbands whose fate might not be confirmed for weeks or even months. The grief was almost impossible to measure. Some believed Hannibal would march directly on Rome itself. The city's walls were inspected. Weapons were distributed. Emergency preparations began immediately. Temples filled with citizens praying for protection, while magistrates worked almost without rest, trying to restore order. Rumors spread through crowded streets faster than anyone could verify them, each story sounding more frightening than the last. Surprisingly, Hannibal never marched on Rome. Historians have debated that decision for more than 2,000 years. Some argue his exhausted army lacked the siege equipment needed to attack a city as heavily fortified as Rome. Others believe his soldiers needed rest after years of campaigning, while supplies and reinforcements remained uncertain. Whatever the reason, Hannibal chose not to risk everything on a direct assault. Instead, he hoped Rome would surrender. It was a reasonable expectation. Many civilizations would have. Rome did not. If anything, the disaster at Cannae revealed the Republic's greatest strength. Not its armies, not its wealth, not even its military tactics, its resilience. The Senate refused negotiations. When Carthage offered to ransom captured Roman prisoners, the Republic declined. Painful though the decision was, Roman leaders believed paying ransom would encourage future demands and signal weakness. It was a harsh choice, one that left many families devastated, but it reflected the Republic's determination never to bargain from a position of fear. The Senate immediately began raising new armies. Young men below the usual military age volunteered. Older veterans returned to service. Even enslaved men were promised freedom in exchange for fighting for the Republic. Rome had lost an army. It simply decided to build another, then another, then another. This refusal to surrender slowly changed the course of the war. Hannibal continued winning remarkable tactical victories, yet each success brought fewer strategic rewards than expected. Rome's allies, though shaken, did not abandon the Republic in the numbers Hannibal had hoped. New Roman armies kept appearing, roads remained open, supplies continued flowing, and the government itself never ceased functioning. It was as though the Republic had become something larger than any single battlefield. Defeat could wound it, but not destroy it. Far from Italy, one young Roman officer had been paying close attention to everything Hannibal had accomplished. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same young man who, years earlier, had reportedly saved his wounded father at the Battle of the Tacanus. While Hannibal dominated Italy, Scipio was quietly building a reputation of his own. his opportunity was approaching, and when it arrived, he would make a decision so unexpected that it would force Hannibal to leave Italy after nearly 15 years of campaigning. The hunter who had terrorized Rome would soon find himself becoming the hunted. After the catastrophe at Cannae, many observers believed Rome's days were numbered. The Republic had lost one of the largest armies it had ever assembled. Tens of thousands of experienced soldiers were gone. Several important allies in southern Italy defected to Hannibal, convinced that Rome's defeat was only a matter of time. Across the Mediterranean, kings and city-states watched closely, wondering whether the balance of power had finally shifted in Carthage's favor. If there was ever a moment when Rome seemed ready to collapse, this was it. Remarkably, it didn't. Instead of chasing Hannibal across Italy with another massive army, the Senate gradually returned to a strategy resembling the one Fabius Maximus had recommended years earlier. Roman commanders avoided unnecessary pitched battles. They defended key cities, protected supply routes, and slowly wore down Hannibal's ability to sustain his army so far from home. It was a frustrating approach for soldiers eager to win glory, but Rome had finally accepted a painful lesson. Defeating Hannibal meant refusing to fight on his terms. While the war dragged on in Italy, another theater of conflict began attracting attention: Spain. Known to the Romans as Hispania, the peninsula had become the economic heart of Carthage's growing power. Its silver mines generated enormous wealth. Its fertile lands supplied food for armies, and its ports connected Carthage to the wider Mediterranean. As long as Carthage controlled Hispania, Hannibal could continue receiving money, supplies, and reinforcements. Rome realized something important. Perhaps the quickest way to weaken Hannibal was not to attack him directly. Perhaps it was to attack everything supporting him. That responsibility fell to a young commander whose name had become increasingly familiar: Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was still remarkably young for such an important command, and many questioned whether he possessed enough experience. Yet those who served under him quickly noticed qualities that separated him from many Roman generals. Scipio studied his enemies carefully. He listened to advisors. He adapted when circumstances changed. Most importantly, he refused to assume that Rome's traditional methods were always the best ones. In some ways, he resembled Hannibal more than either man might have cared to admit. Scipio arrived in Hispania around 210 BC, inheriting a difficult situation. Roman forces had suffered earlier setbacks, and much of the peninsula remained under Carthaginian influence. Rather than launching reckless attacks, he spent time gathering intelligence about local geography, enemy movements, and the political loyalties of surrounding communities. Preparation came before action. It was a habit that would define his career. His first great opportunity appeared in 209 BC. The Carthaginians controlled a heavily fortified coastal city known as New Carthage, today's Cartagena in southeastern Spain. It served as their principal base in Hispania, containing valuable supplies, military equipment, hostages from allied tribes, and one of the region's finest harbors. Capturing it would dramatically change the course of the war. Most commanders would have expected a long siege. Scipio had something else in mind. Ancient sources describe how Roman scouts discovered that a shallow lagoon bordering the city became passable during certain tides. Whether through careful observation, local knowledge, or a combination of both, Scipio recognized an opportunity that the defenders believed impossible. While Roman forces attacked the city's main walls, another group quietly crossed the lagoon and assaulted New Carthage from an unexpected direction. The defenders were caught completely off guard. Within a single day, one of Carthage's most important strongholds had fallen. The victory transformed Rome's position in Hispania almost overnight. Huge quantities of weapons and supplies were captured. Treasure filled Roman storehouses. Hostages held by Carthage were treated with surprising generosity before being released, a decision that earned Scipio considerable goodwill among local tribes. Rather than ruling entirely through fear, he understood the value of winning allies. Sometimes kindness accomplishes what armies cannot. Scipio also earned admiration through an act that later Roman writers frequently celebrated. According to ancient accounts, after New Carthage fell, soldiers presented him with a beautiful captive woman. Learning that she was already promised in marriage to a local prince, Scipio returned her unharmed to her family instead of keeping her as a prize of war. The story, whether embellished or entirely accurate, became an enduring example of Roman ideals concerning discipline and self-control. It was exactly the sort of tale Roman historians loved to preserve. Not because it proved every Roman behaved perfectly, but because it illustrated the virtues they hoped their leaders would possess. Meanwhile, Hannibal remained in Italy, still dangerous but increasingly isolated. Years of campaigning had reduced his veteran army. Reinforcements from Carthage arrived only sporadically, while Roman armies slowly recovered from earlier disasters. Every passing year shifted the balance just a little farther away from Hannibal and a little closer toward Rome. The Republic no longer feared immediate destruction. Now it was beginning to think about victory. Scipio understood that defeating Carthage in Spain would never be enough. If Rome truly wished to end the war, it would eventually have to strike at the enemy's homeland itself. Such a proposal sounded almost reckless. No Roman army had ever attempted anything quite like it. Invading North Africa would force Carthage to defend its own cities for the first time in generations. It would also force one man to make an impossible decision: Hannibal Barca. The commander who had spent nearly 15 years fighting on Italian soil would soon receive word that his own homeland was under threat. For the first time since crossing the Alps, he would be forced to turn around. By 204 BC, the balance of the Second Punic War had shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Hannibal still occupied parts of southern Italy, but the unstoppable momentum that had carried him from the Alps to Cannae had slowly faded. His army remained disciplined and dangerous, yet it was no longer growing stronger. Many of his veteran soldiers had spent more than a decade campaigning far from home. Reinforcements arrived only occasionally, supplies became increasingly difficult to obtain, and several of Rome's allies had remained loyal despite years of pressure. Rome, meanwhile, had done exactly what Hannibal never expected. It had refused to give up. Every devastating defeat had been answered by another army. Every setback had produced another plan. Every lost battle had become another lesson. The Republic had survived not because it never failed, but because it never accepted failure as permanent. While Hannibal waited in Italy, Scipio convinced the Roman Senate to approve one of the boldest operations in the Republic's history. Instead of continuing to chase Hannibal across Italy, he proposed invading North Africa itself. The idea was both brilliant and risky. If Roman armies threatened Carthage directly, the city would have little choice but to recall its greatest general from Italy. Hannibal had spent years trying to force Rome onto the defensive. Now Rome intended to do the same to him. In 204 BC, Scipio crossed the Mediterranean with a Roman army and landed on the African coast. The invasion shocked Carthaginian leaders, who suddenly found enemy soldiers marching through territory they had considered secure for generations. Farms were abandoned, local communities strengthened their defenses, and urgent messages spread toward Carthage requesting immediate assistance. The war had come home. Scipio also demonstrated another quality that made him such an effective commander. He understood the importance of allies. One of the most valuable kingdoms in North Africa was Numidia, famous throughout the ancient world for its exceptional cavalry. Numidian horsemen could move with astonishing speed across difficult terrain, often deciding battles through mobility rather than brute force. For years, many Numidians had fought alongside Carthage. Scipio worked tirelessly to change that. His alliance with the Numidian prince Massinissa proved to be one of the most important diplomatic victories of the entire war. Massinissa brought thousands of skilled cavalrymen to the Roman cause, giving Scipio an advantage that previous Roman commanders had often lacked against Hannibal. Sometimes wars are won as much through diplomacy as they are through swords. Carthage understood the danger immediately. The city had little choice left. Its greatest general had to return. Imagine Hannibal receiving that message after nearly 15 years in Italy. For over a decade, he had marched across the peninsula, defeated Roman armies that outnumbered his own, terrified the Republic, and earned a reputation that would echo through history. Every hill, river, and road in southern Italy carried memories of campaigns fought beside soldiers who had followed him through impossible hardships. Now he was being ordered home. not because he had been defeated in battle, because his own homeland needed him. Ancient writers described the departure as deeply emotional. Hannibal reportedly looked back toward Italy one final time before boarding his ships, leaving behind the country where he had achieved many of history's greatest military victories. He would never return. The final confrontation came in 202 BC near the town of Zama, southwest of Carthage. For the first time, two of history's greatest commanders faced one another directly. Hannibal, Scipio. Both had spent years studying war. Both understood strategy, logistics, leadership, and human psychology at an extraordinary level. Each knew the other would make very few mistakes. Ancient historians even preserve a story that the two commanders met before the battle to discuss peace. Whether the meeting occurred exactly as described remains uncertain, but the image has fascinated historians for centuries. Two legendary generals standing face to face, fully aware that the next day's battle would shape the future of the Mediterranean. Peace proved impossible. The following morning, the armies advanced. Hannibal once again deployed war elephants at the front of his army, hoping to disrupt the Roman formations before the infantry engaged. Scipio, however, had studied previous battles carefully. Rather than presenting an unbroken wall of soldiers, he arranged his legions in columns separated by open lanes. As the elephants charged, Roman trumpets sounded loudly across the battlefield. Startled by the noise, some animals veered away from the Roman lines altogether. Others passed harmlessly through the carefully prepared gaps before being driven off by Roman soldiers waiting behind them. Hannibal's opening attack had failed. The battle soon became a fierce contest between experienced infantry on both sides. For hours, neither army gained a decisive advantage. Then Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, having driven away the Carthaginian horsemen, returned to the battlefield at precisely the right moment. The attack struck Hannibal's army from the rear. History had come full circle. 16 years earlier, Hannibal had surrounded the Romans at Cannae using almost the same principle. Now Scipio used superior cavalry to decide the battle against Hannibal himself. By the end of the day, Carthage's army had been defeated. The Second Punic War was over. The peace terms imposed on Carthage were severe. The city surrendered its remaining war elephants, reduced its navy to only a handful of ships, paid enormous financial reparations, and agreed not to wage war without Rome's permission. Although Carthage survived, it would never again challenge Rome as an equal power. Scipio returned home in triumph. The Senate awarded him a new name, Scipio Africanus, a title honoring the victory that had secured Rome's future. For the Republic, the consequences reached far beyond a single war. Rome had defeated the greatest military commander of its age. It had proven that its influence extended well beyond Italy. The Mediterranean was changing. A new superpower had emerged. Yet success would bring challenges almost as great as those it had overcome. Wealth poured into Rome from newly conquered territories. Powerful generals became even more influential. Political rivalries intensified. The republic that had once fought simply to survive now had to learn how to govern an expanding empire. Ironically, Rome's greatest victories would eventually create the problems that threatened to destroy the republic from within. The age of foreign conquest was only beginning. Soon, another extraordinary figure would rise through the ranks of Roman politics. His name was Julius Caesar, and his story would change the course of history forever. As the dust settled after the Battle of Zama and the Second Punic War finally came to an end, Rome stood at the beginning of an entirely new chapter. For nearly 5 centuries, the Republic had struggled simply to survive. It had defended its hills against neighboring tribes, overthrown its kings, endured political conflict, and fought wars that pushed its citizens to the very edge of endurance. Now, for the first time, Rome found itself asking a different question. Not how to survive, but how to govern success. Victories brought opportunities that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Merchant ships carrying grain, wine, olive oil, marble, spices, and precious metals flowed steadily into Roman ports. New provinces contributed taxes that enriched the Republic, while victorious generals returned home with stories, knowledge, and cultures gathered from every corner of the Mediterranean. the world suddenly seemed much larger, and Rome found itself at its center. The Republic's engineers quickly became some of its greatest heroes, though history rarely remembers their names. Across Italy and beyond, they constructed roads with remarkable precision, carefully layering stone, gravel, and drainage systems so that many remained usable for centuries. These roads allowed soldiers to march rapidly toward distant frontiers, merchants to transport goods more efficiently, and ordinary travelers to journey farther than previous generations ever imagined. The old saying that all roads lead to Rome wasn't entirely true, but after enough roads were built, it certainly began to feel that way. Travel itself slowly transformed. Messages that once required weeks could now arrive in days. Trade connected communities separated by mountains and rivers. Ideas spread alongside merchants, carrying languages, inventions, religious beliefs, and customs throughout the growing republic. The Romans understood something surprisingly modern. Infrastructure creates opportunity. The same philosophy appeared in their cities. Engineers designed aqueducts that carried fresh water across valleys and hills using only gravity. Public fountains supplied neighborhoods with clean water, while baths became gathering places where citizens could relax, socialize, and discuss politics, business, or the latest military campaigns. Massive drainage systems reduced flooding and improved sanitation, making Rome one of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world. Many of these achievements still inspire engineers today. Some Roman bridges remain standing after 2,000 years. Sections of Roman roads continue supporting modern traffic. Ruins that once served ordinary citizens now attract visitors from every continent. Stone, when placed with extraordinary care, can outlive entire civilizations. Rome's influence reached far beyond architecture. The Republic developed a legal system that became increasingly organized over time. Laws were written and displayed publicly so citizens could understand them. Contracts governed trade. Courts settled disputes. Property rights, legal procedures, and civic responsibilities gradually evolved into principles that influenced countless societies long after the Republic itself disappeared. Modern legal systems are not copies of Roman law, but many still carry its fingerprints. Language followed a similar path. The Romans spoke Latin, a language that echoed through military camps, bustling marketplaces, temples, farms, and Senate chambers. Centuries later, Latin would gradually evolve into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, and several other Romance languages. Even English, despite its Germanic origins, borrowed thousands of Latin words through centuries of cultural exchange. Without realizing it, millions of people still speak fragments of ancient Rome every single day. Its influence even reaches something as ordinary as the calendar. The months of January, March, April, June, and many others preserve names rooted in Roman tradition. Julius Caesar's calendar reforms eventually shaped the Julian calendar, which later became the foundation for the Gregorian calendar used across much of the world today. Every time we glance at a calendar, we quietly acknowledge Rome. Its architecture remains equally familiar. Government buildings throughout the world continue using Roman-inspired columns, domes, arches, and grand public spaces. The Capitol in Washington, the Pantheon-inspired buildings of Europe, countless courthouses, museums, universities, and memorials all reflect ideas first refined thousands of years ago. Even when we don't notice them, Rome is often hiding in plain sight. Perhaps the Republic's greatest legacy, however, was not a road, a building, or even a law. It was an idea, the belief that citizens could share responsibility for governing their state. The Republic was far from democratic by modern standards. Women could not vote. Enslaved people possessed almost no rights. Political power remained concentrated among wealthy families for much of its history. It was imperfect, sometimes deeply so. Yet it introduced concepts that later generations continued refining for centuries. Elected officials, limited terms of office, checks on executive power, written laws, civic duty, and the belief that government should serve something larger than one individual. Those ideas would outlive the Republic itself. Ironically, Rome's greatest triumph also planted the seeds of its greatest crisis. Every victory brought more wealth. Every conquest expanded the Republic's borders. Every successful general returned home more famous than the last. The political system that had governed a modest Italian city suddenly found itself responsible for lands stretching across the Mediterranean. Institutions designed for a small republic struggled to manage a rapidly growing empire. Power became increasingly personal. Ambition grew, competition intensified. The balance that earlier Romans had fought so carefully to preserve began showing signs of strain. Few citizens walking through the Forum after the victory at Zama could have imagined how dramatically their world would change over the next century. They celebrated peace, prosperity, and security without realizing they were living during the final generations of the Republic's golden age. Soon, new names would dominate Roman history: Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and finally, Julius Caesar. Each would leave a permanent mark upon Rome. Each would move the Republic one step closer to becoming something entirely different. But those are stories for another evening. For now, it is enough to remember that everything which followed, the emperors, the Colosseum, the Pax Romana, and the vast empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, was built upon the foundations laid by generations of ordinary Romans who simply hoped to protect their homes, raise their families, and leave their city a little stronger than they had found it. More than 2,000 years have passed since those first farmers settled beside the Tiber River. Their voices are long silent, their homes have become ruins. Their republic has faded into history, and yet, in countless ways both obvious and subtle, the world still carries echoes of ancient Rome. As our journey through ancient Rome comes to an end, the sounds of marching legions, bustling marketplaces, and lively Senate debates slowly begin to fade into history. Over the course of this story, we've watched a small settlement beside the Tiber River grow into the most powerful republic the Mediterranean had ever seen. We've met legendary founders and determined farmers, ambitious senators and brilliant generals. We've crossed mountains with Hannibal, stood beside Roman soldiers at Cannae, and watched Scipio Africanus reshape the future of the ancient world. Yet perhaps the most remarkable lesson isn't found in a single battle or famous name. It's the realization that history is built by ordinary people living ordinary days. Most Romans never commanded armies. They never addressed the Senate. They never appeared in history books. They woke before sunrise, worked their fields, baked bread, raised children, repaired roads, crafted pottery, traded in crowded markets, and hoped for peaceful tomorrows just as people do today. Empires rise because of countless ordinary lives quietly unfolding together. Even now, if you could somehow walk through the streets of ancient Rome at night, you would hear familiar sounds: a distant dog barking, footsteps echoing across worn stone roads, the crackle of a cooking fire, parents settling restless children to sleep, neighbors finishing quiet conversations before another day begins. Across more than 2,000 years, humanity is often more familiar than different. The Roman Republic would eventually become an empire. That empire would one day reach extraordinary heights before gradually declining over centuries. Cities would rise, emperors would come and go, monuments would weather, roads would crack, temples would become ruins, and yet the stories remained. Generation after generation carried them forward until, tonight, they found their way to you. If you've drifted off somewhere along our journey, then ancient Rome has once again become a place of quiet dreams. And if you're still awake, thank you for spending part of your evening exploring one of history's greatest civilizations. Wherever you are, I hope this story brought a little curiosity, a little peace, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the people whose lives shaped our world so long ago. Now, let the sounds of history grow quieter. Allow your thoughts to slow. Feel the weight of the day gently fall away, and imagine the warm glow of distant lanterns fading across the hills of Rome as the city settles beneath a calm Mediterranean night. Sleep well, and until our next journey into history, good night.